Okay, we're going to begin our meeting with a flag salute led by my esteemed colleague from District 2, Mr. Wygant.
I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
Thank you, Mr. Wygant. Okay, given that we only have one item on our agenda this afternoon, we did not agendize any time for public comment. However, given that this is Tahoe and people enjoy the opportunity to chat with us from time to time up here, I'm going to go ahead and take public comment. Anybody might have anything to address the board on that is not relative to the one item that we do have on our agenda. Is there anybody that wishes to address the board on anything that's not on the agenda for this afternoon? Prove me wrong. Okay. We'll go ahead then and move on to our one and only item. That is the 1:30 item, a workshop on achievable housing. And I believe, Ms. Merchant, are you leading the conversation today?
Yes, Mr. Chair, I am. Thank you very much, Mr. Chair and members of the board. Jennifer Merchant, for the record, with the County Executive Office. And I did want to kick off the presentation today to talk a little bit, if I can make the button work. There we go. To talk about the purpose of the workshop. And as you know, we've been focusing more distinctly on housing over the last couple years and developed a housing work plan, in fact, two that your board has approved since 2017. And we thought it would be a great time as we're here in the Tahoe area where we have I would say, a more crucial housing challenge in the eastern Placer County portion of the county, as well as the entire region, to really focus on what we're accomplishing, what are some of the best practices that we see in resorts like ours, in communities like ours, as well as in the state of California, and then what are our partners doing and what do they see to be the key problems that we need to be solving together. So we put together an agenda for you to allow for an opportunity for that kind of information, and then some real good discussion between you and the community and staff on priorities that you would like to see us undertake in the upcoming year. So just a quick overview of how we plan to roll this out today. Shauna Purvines will provide an update on the fiscal year 18-19 housing work plan on what we've accomplished to date and what things are underway and some things that we will be working on before we get to the end of the fiscal year. Stacy Caldwell and Shauna Doherty. Stacy Caldwell is CEO of the Tahoe Truckee Community Foundation, and then Shauna Doherty, their program director, will be talking about what they have accomplished since they spoke with you in the last 6 months, and then where they really see the focus of the regional entities that they have convened wanting to make progress on through their 3-year tenure as an organization. And then we've brought forward some stakeholders in the community to discuss their challenges and some ideas they may have about how Placer County can better engage with local jurisdictions and private businesses to solve our challenges. And then we'll roll into our featured speaker, George Ruther. He's a housing director with the town of Vail. We spent a lot of time with him in the last 6 months. A large group of us took a trip to Vail, Colorado to learn about what they're doing in that area, in both the towns as well as the counties and the mountain areas in Colorado. And he's been out here once earlier, well, last year, earlier this fiscal year, and talked with a lot of business leaders and local government leaders about approaches they've taken. And we thought it would be a good time for him to talk to your board about that, to hopefully inspire some ideas that we might consider taking on in Placer County. And then we'll close things out with a very quick overview about some best practices that Shauna and I have been just kind of scratching the surface on analyzing within the state of California and local jurisdictions here, and then hopefully get some direction from your board on what did inspire you and what you would like to see us work on in the next 6 months. So, all of that said, up next will be Shauna Purvines, Principal Planner with the Community Development Resources Agency, to talk about the housing plan. Thank you.
Good afternoon. Shauna Purvines with the Community Development Resources Agency. And I am just going to take a few minutes just to kind of do a brief update where we're at. You'll remember this plan, this annual plan, the 1819, was just approved in September, albeit we've been pretty busy. The 4 components remain the same as they did the first year. There's a component of planning and research, incentives and regulations, funding and resources, and then our legislative advocacy and communication. The first annual work program, which was 1718, had 30 tasks. I guess we were feeling pretty good, and we added 9 more just to kick it up this year. So under the component 1, planning and research, tasks that are currently underway, we are analyzing the internal and external institutional structure. That's really what we're here today to talk more about. We've also, the Government Center Master Plan and the Mercy Housing Project is in preparation for its final approval hearings. We're actually expecting those this spring to be coming to both the Planning Commission and to your board. We are in the process of preparing building an ADU guidebook to assist people with how to build those secondary dwelling units. Task completed. We did complete the Tiny House on Wheels ordinance. We have moved that into the larger code update that we are working on. We are monitoring and tracking affordable housing obligations. Currently to date, we have approximately about 400 units that are currently deed restricted. We're also monitoring our housing opportunity sites. We identified about 104 of those from last year. These are sites that are currently designated for high-density residential, multifamily. They're in both our multifamily and commercial zones. And they're the ones that are of relative size, a little more than 2 acres, usually within proximity to services and facilities, public water, sewer, roads, and such. We'll be actually starting to reach out to those property owners and start talking with them to see their interest in maybe doing something on those sites here probably in the next few weeks. The draft EIR for the Government Center Master Plan is completed. It was released for public comments, and as I mentioned, we're getting ready for those public hearings now. Under Component 2 are incentives and regulations. Tasks that are underway, we are processing those, or we're in the beginning of processing our design standard revisions and preparing revisions to our policies and ordinances. These are to look for ways to reduce the constraints to the development of housing and affordable housing as it relates to any of our local codes and regulations. Again, we're preparing that ADU guidebook. We're initiating process improvements to review and streamline that approval process. We understand time is money. We'd like to get people in and out sooner. And then we're also analyzing the option for missing middle income households and looking to bring that AMI up to 195%. I think the last time we were here at Tahoe, maybe it was 2 times ago, you received that presentation from TRPA, who has already adopted that. And so as part of ours, we're also looking to see about amending or modifying that affordability level. Under Component 3, which is funding and resources, we did final the in lieu fee recommendation for board action. We are in the process of meeting with the stakeholder group. We've had 3 meetings to date. We have 4 meetings to date. We have 1 more that we are meeting next week. Based on their input, we look to come back this spring with a summary of their kind of identified solutions and suggestions to the affordable housing need. Primarily in Western County, we're relying on a lot of the great work here in Eastern County with Mountain Housing Council and their efforts on the east. But we are planning on bringing that back, and I am possibly the recommendation again on the in lieu fee in probably about April. We've initiated an affordable housing finance and investment strategy. We're under contract with Bay Area Economics to look at what the cost of affordable housing is for Placer County, what are some of our funding sources, and then what are some of the best ways to invest that to gain the best return on investment. We hope to have that actually completed also at the end of March, early April. We are preparing the CDBG and No Place Like Home grant, and we have secured the NAHOUS property. or we are in the process of securing the NAHOS property, I should say. And then task completed, we secured $1 million for the homeless individuals. This was a contribution in partnership with Sutter. And then NAHOS property nonprofit developer partners have been identified. And you'll actually meet with them today as part of the panel. So component 4, legislative advocacy and communication. Tasks that are underway right now, the housing stakeholder meetings, as I mentioned. We actually did have our 4th meeting last week. This just hadn't gotten updated. Working with the PIO to improve our website and outreach on our housing issues. We're also working very closely with the countywide housing webpage update to bring some fresh look at some of our housing solutions that we have as part of that effort. And then Plan 2019 Housing Forum. This year we're calling it a block party. And we're looking to have it in May. And this is an opportunity for us to bring developers and builders and contractors together with those property owners. So that's a big focus of our annual forum. Task completed. The county did update its legislative housing platform, completed the secondary dwelling application survey. We actually reached out to 2 years of applicants who completed the construction of a secondary dwelling. And we got some really great feedback. For the most part, they were pretty happy with the county and its processes, but gave us some suggestions about making it more clear what fees are going to be involved, and then just the process in and of itself, just so that they had a better understanding of what they were getting themselves into. And then continuing our investment and commitment to the Mountain Housing Council. So that's the brief update of what we've been working on in the last few months since the adoption. And at this point, I think I'm turning it over to Stacy and Shauna.
Mr. Chair? I was actually hoping that there was something that was brought up under task completed for component 3 that I think it would be useful for members of the community here in Eastern Placer to know a little bit more about, and that's the $1 million that we receive for homeless individuals with disabilities. Jeff, would you, sorry, I didn't even mention I was going to ask this, but would you be willing just to explain a tiny little bit so people are familiar with what this is?
So I'm Jeff Brown, your Health and Human Services Agency Director. This grant from Sutter Health is in partnership with our Whole Person Care Grant, which is really focused on individuals with disabilities who are frequent utilizers of public services, such as the jail, such as public hospitals, but also psychiatric health facilities. So about 2 years ago, we received a $1 million grant. We purchased individual housing in terms of a shared housing model where we would put 5, 6, up to 8 individuals in one house, depending on the zoning. And so we purchased 2 properties on the western side, and we will be looking to similarly utilize these dollars for that program. These dollars are not specifically targeted to this side of the county, particularly because we need people that are enrolled in our whole person care program. We do not have anyone on this side of the county enrolled in that program. But I will say this year we have targeted up to $1 million in Mental Health Services Act dollars to purchase a property on this side of the hill to serve similar individuals that we work with in the Tahoe region.
Excellent. Thank you.
Great. Thanks.
Jeff, Supervisor. That grant also calls for some subsidization for housing. How does that work as well?
Well, that's actually an alternative.
Okay.
So if at the end of the day, if we couldn't find housing or if we only used a portion of it, then we would be able to use some of those dollars to help subsidize rents as a shallow rent subsidy. Our goal, though, will be to purchase new housing and to try to put people in. But again, if we run into difficulties in either with purchasing or for individuals that have specific needs, where we have identified rental housing, but we need some sort of income to bridge, we have the ability with Sutter's blessing to go ahead and use the dollars for that type of use.
Okay, thank you.
You're welcome.
So I just I wanted to stand up and introduce Stacy Caldwell, the CEO of the Tahoe Truckee Community Foundation, and point out the reason why the Community Foundation is engaged in this is because their board, among a lot of other initiatives that they undertake every year, has focused on housing. And they were originally a partner with us in developing the housing needs assessment with the town of Truckee and Nevada County, and have since initiated this much larger regional effort where we're focusing a lot of partners on trying to solve our challenges. I will point out that Stacy also throws a great party, and she did so on Saturday night, where there were dozens and dozens, if not over 100 people who all wore winter white to celebrate the 20th anniversary of the organization. One of their former presidents, Wally Auerbach, is here, and he and his wife Cindy were there, and it was an excellent success story where we really celebrated the achievements of the organization, housing being one of the main focuses. So I wanted to point that out because they work on housing as well as a lot of other important initiatives in our community, and really generating support, both funding as well as volunteer hours on behalf of the Tahoe Truckee region. So wanted to introduce her in that context. Stacy, come on up.
Good morning. It's still morning, right? Good afternoon. It was a good party. Thank you so much for being here today. We're so delighted when you come to Tahoe, and we're even more delighted that you're spending your afternoon on the topic of housing. We've seen a lot of progress, and we're here today to share that progress. I'd like to invite Shauna Doherty up here to join me. I'm going to open it up, and she's going to take it away because she is really on the ground every day driving the Mountain Housing Council initiative. But I just want to say, I just feel like our partnership with Placer County has transformed in these last 2 years. Not only with the Community Foundation, but how you guys have dug into thinking about housing up here. The work that Shauna and Jennifer are doing is so important, and we feel like you guys are right at the table, shoulder to shoulder with us, and we really appreciate it. So thank you for that.
Thank you.
All right, Shauna, come on up. All right, and then we have the presentation ready to go.
I just need to advance it, I'm sorry.
Oh, me.
She went back.
That was me.
It was there.
Back at it. Nope, 2,
Underway.
3, 4.
There you go.
Very good. I know. So as Jennifer mentioned, the Community Foundation's mission is much bigger than housing. We're not a housing authority. We're not a housing trust. But when we realized that housing was a significant issue for our community, after embarking on that 2016 regional housing study, it was the Community Foundation board and many of their past board chairs that said, we have a role to play up here. We need to take a leadership role because there's no one entity that can fix this. We're going to have to develop a collaboration. But as you can see, we actually have other things we do. We provide significant grant funding and scholarships to our community. So we're always working with donors to attract that kind of resource to our community. And then when we're not giving out money, we're focused on things like strengthening our family. So we're actually talking about a new partnership around mental health here, which is very exciting, being led by one of our donors. We're really deep into forest work right now. And so we're actually, tomorrow, we're submitting a significant grant request to CAL FIRE to address our biomass piles that surround us and our forest. And so local housing, of course, is our Mountain Housing Council. And then we're looking to how we can stimulate a more diversified economy beyond snow. So those are the areas that the foundation is committed to. And if we can go one more. But we're here to talk about housing. And if you'll recall, a year and a half ago, we actually embarked on a formalized partnership, the Mountain Housing Council, which represents 29 different partners in this region. When I first came to Tahoe, I was told the reason we can't get anything done here is because we have 3 different jurisdictions and 17 special districts. And we really decided that that could be our strength, if we could get them all aligned, because each one of those organizations represents a board, and each one of those boards represents constituents. So if we can get the organizations that represent our region together and those top leaders to help make decisions on behalf of housing, maybe we can gain some traction. And sure enough, they showed up, and you can see that not only do we have the special districts and our jurisdictions all committed, but we have organizations like the Resort Association, we have the 2 chambers, we have our Family Resource Center, both of them. And so we have our different nonprofits represented through the Community Collaborative, and then we have our major employers of the resorts at the table, all rowing in the same direction, all using the same language, achievable local housing up to 195%, and all focused on different policy recommendations as we go forward. So with that, I get to hand it over to you for the rest of this. And I'll come back at the end. How's that? Okay.
So, good afternoon, Shauna Doherty, Project Director for Mountain Housing Council. So before I get started, I just wanted to open with a little bit of a story about the power of collaboration. I'm starting to work in other communities on housing, and I've been down in Mammoth, excuse me, helping them a little bit. And what's fascinating is being in another mountain community where there isn't a collaboration and there isn't a community foundation. They have the leadership in place, but without the collaboration, what is really interesting is there's not this sort of entity wrapping their arms around everyone's work and saying, okay, so we're all moving forward together. So it's fantastic, Chamber, that you're doing this, and it's fantastic, Ski Hill, that they're doing this. There's seems to be sort of some territory issues going on, and it's really blocking some movement forward. So it's just a new story that's entering in with the power of collaboration. I know this always happens. Stacy's going to get me every time I get up on the mic, it triggers.
Do you need cough drops?
No, it's just water. Thank you.
I have cough drops.
Okay. Is it hot? Thank you.
Anyone? Cough drops?
Thank you, Stacy. Cough drops. So what's different from when we started? I'm just going to go really quickly. 354 units that are in the works. That means that the hammers are going, and in our case, the cranes are bringing in the modulars. So it's exciting to do this work and actually start to see the physical buildings going up. And we're just going to highlight some of these. Some are in Placer, some are in Nevada County, town of Truckee. But I'm just going to highlight the stories of innovation coming out of these. Obviously, I'm starting with yours. And the first word I wanted to put up there is leadership. Just congratulations to your staff, to you as a board. It truly is tremendous show of leadership that we did not necessarily have in this region. And I can speak all about the leadership of the Mountain Housing Council and the Community Foundation, but Placer County, you really, really stepped up and are showing us, what it means to really go and do this work. So thank you very much. Collaboration, I'm hoping that all of us coming together, once again, wrapping our arms around this project as a collective and helping Placer County through this very challenging and ambitious project will be a model for how we do projects in the future. And then, hopefully we house a lot of people. So I'm excited about that. Tahoe City Marina in Placer County, what's exciting about this is that it shows us a model for rehabbing an existing building, and also that the market is there for fewer parking spots. So if you do a project on a transportation line, customers do want that, and they're willing to live without a car. And that's kind of exciting for thinking about future housing. This is, if I had a picture today, it would show the modulars. So we have 138 deed-restricted rentals going in Truckee. And what's new about this is that it's happening quite quickly. Two things is the streamlined regulatory process, and then also the use of modulars. This is exciting because the town, for their inclusionary policy, has done an exception where they're allowing market rate, but 100% deed restriction as their inclusionary requirement, and just seeing how that works. So a new model, and if it works, we're hoping to see more of this. Meadowview, this is in Martis, but in Placer County. What's exciting about this is we are one of 19 projects that secured funding from cap and trade funding. That means we were competing with Oakland and Sacramento and all the urban areas. And our partners came together quickly and submitted a very competitive proposal, and it means that our name as a region is on the map for being competitive for this type of funding. So how do we keep moving forward, continuing to do what we do? Obviously, private investment is going to be key. So making sure our region is known as a great place to do work. Mountain Housing Council, with our partnership all moving in the same direction, does send a signal that we're here and we're excited and we want to move things forward, but that we need to make sure our policies and our programs are in place to attract that private investment. We're going to continue to focus on the priorities that were set forth by the council, so I'm going to speak a little bit to some of these, but really making sure that we're supporting our employers that are really stepping up and really moving much quicker than we can to provide really creative solutions for their own employees. Local funding, I'm going to speak to that, always looking for identifying land and then working at the state level. One of our mantras is always trying to focus on expanding the diversity of housing here. We know that 79% of our housing stock is single family. What we're seeing a lot of the market coming forward is the rental, which is what we really need. But we also need all of those in-betweens, right? You saw Shauna speaking about secondary units. There's diversity even in speaking about that. Supportive housing, we spoke about that. There's not a high level of understanding of what that means. So we're making sure that we're doing a lot of education around these different types of housing, so when the projects come forward, the public and the community is aware of those needs. And this is our regional policy agenda that you've seen before, but I'm going to speak just a little bit about the progress in each of those areas. So for tomorrow specifically, so let me go back actually. So we came to you last year with this definition of affordable, achievable local housing. And then we have a policy proposal on fees that at some point will be brought to you. Your staff, particularly Jennifer Merchant and Lindsay have been extraordinary in spending time with us on the short-term rental white paper that's to come out in mid-February. It's not a policy recommendation. Again, it's a technical sort of white paper on our market for all of you to look at. And then tomorrow you're going to be looking at the Mountain Housing Council's state and federal policy platform that it's in your packet, and I'm just going to speak a little bit to it. And then we're also working on ADU in conjunction with all the work that's happening already with at the jurisdictions. So a little bit on the policy platform. I'll just go over this real briefly. We're partnering with Sierra Business Council, who's an expert in state advocacy, and they're kind of our front team on that and supporting us to really leverage the power of the 29 partners. When we go down to the state and there's this promising pot of housing dollars, and we want to make sure that they know that we're up here. We want to make sure that we're in on the guidelines to make sure when the money comes forward that it works for our region. And we want to be down there building relationships so that when our project proposals do go forward, they remember that there's a voice up here in the Sierra and that we care and we want a piece of that pie. So activities that we're going to focus on is 1 to 3 high priority bills. In your packet is a summary of the proposal of those areas that we want to focus on. We're going to go down in February as a group to shake hands, make sure people know that we're up here. We have a big reach. We mean business. And then we're going to hopefully coordinate with each of the jurisdictions who have lobbyists. So I'm not going to talk about the fee actually today. So in the works, I'm not talking about that, right? No. Okay. Now that's for the future, but just remember that. Short-term rentals, very exciting topic for everybody. We're very excited that in February we're going to put forth the first comprehensive regional study of what our short-term rental market looks like. I think many of the community who tracks this have seen snippets of this information, but never in one place. And then we're bringing in sort of what other communities are doing. We had a group of 22 stakeholders that worked for the last 11 and a half months on this topic, looking at that data, looking at that information, and putting forward a set of agreements. And then it is really up to the jurisdictions to digest that information, learn from it. Hopefully the community learns from it, and it's to inform further discussion. So that's just a summary of what I just said. We will be putting that on our website. I can't tell you the exact date because it depends on feedback from our group. But the day after Valentine's Day is our goal. Accessory dwelling units and movable tiny homes is the next. That will be a policy recommendation that comes out. As we know, the state put forward a set of mandates, and in each of the jurisdictions needs to update their ordinance to match the state. I know that Placer County is working with TRPA on that, but our role with Mountain Housing Council is making, and you saw Shauna speak to this, is how do we make this easier for people to do this? We know the policies are in place, so why are people not knocking on our doors and why is not everybody doing this? We've got to figure out how to make this. That's our role as Mountain Housing Council and our team, figuring out ways to make it easier. Is it about marketing, communication? Is it about the guide that Shauna Purvines mentioned? What is it that's going to make this easier, and can we put forward some recommendations around that? So this is just a little bit of the summary of, again, they are allowed, but what can we do to make sure if they're allowed, why are people not doing more of them? So this is the last slide. I think Stacy's going to talk about year 2 and where we're headed. Thank you so much. And I'm going to hand out these the impact placemats. Thank you.
Okay, so where we're heading. So again, just a reminder, Mountain Housing Council is a 3-year initiative of the Tahoe Truckee Community Foundation. So we've always known that we're temporary stewards of this conversation. What we didn't want to do was come out of that regional housing study and just launch the next special district or the next new entity that needs care and feeding as a community. We really wanted to bring everybody together, kind of answer some of the bigger questions for ourselves, kind of build a game plan, and then figure out where this work sits in the future. So that's what's happening right now. We have an RFP out for consultants who can help us think through what kind of entity we need. There are already existing entities that can be leveraged. So if we don't have to create a new one, that would be great. But if there is an entity that comes out of it, it will basically come from this report that we have commissioned, and then further discussion and dialogue at the Mountain Housing Council, which means that whatever decision gets made, our community is supporting because of that partnership. And then the second piece of that entity is the stable funding. And so both jurisdictions, Town of Truckee and Placer County, Placer County is undergoing right now a funding study. You guys have already done it, or maybe I just flipped that. Where's Shauna? You can shake your head or not shake your head. But either way, you're both looking at sustainable funding sources for housing. And at our last Mountain Housing Council meeting, we asked ourselves, what is the role of Mountain Housing Council in that? It's not necessarily to put something out for the community. It's to back up what our jurisdictions choose to do with those funding sources, if we can be in conversation about the use of those funds and what makes the most sense for our community. So we want to be at the table. We want to help shape that with you. And then if it really aligns with that Mountain Housing Council piece, help endorse it and really drive it home so that this region has sustainable funding for housing. And we recognize it's probably going to look different in different parts of our region, but we have with the council, the Mountain Housing Council, the opportunity for us to have regional momentum behind those different pieces. And the final part of that, the base of those two kind of tracks that wrap up the work of the Mountain Housing Council, is community readiness. We need to take the work that Mountain Housing Council has done on the policies and these studies, and we need to synthesize it and break it down for the community to really understand and grab onto, so that as those two decisions that need to get made, the community is with us and behind us. And we have a really great community that's engaged in this conversation, but we need a broader base of support to continue the work moving forward. So really readying the community, because it's change. It represents change in this region, and change can be really scary. And so engaging our community around that conversation of what does it look like, how is it different, what innovation are we willing to accept as a community, is the final piece for the Mountain Housing Council. So with that, I think we're done, other than thank you so much for being a partner at the table, for being a funding partner to help sustain the work. And we've got more that we have yet to do, but it's all heading in a good direction. So any questions?
Questions by board members? I don't see any.
Okay.
Thank you very much for your
Thank you.
presentation.
Really
Very
appreciate it.
informative.
Thank you.
Okay, Chairman Euler.
Yes.
I am going to move us on into the next portion of our discussion and invite the panel to go take your spots over there at the table. Sorry it's so far away from your board. I'm hoping that you can see it from the distance and still want to.
We're not that old.
You're not that old?
We can still see that far.
Well, Bonnie's really close, but Jim's not, I noticed.
And are you going to be moderating the panel?
Actually, Stacy Caldwell's going to do that.
Okay.
But I wanted to just stand up and invite them up to the table and really point out that I think one of the benefits of our participation in the Mountain Housing Council has really been the conversations that we've had with our jurisdictions that are in our county, that are adjacent to our county, with the large businesses, with the small businesses, and that's really the power in convening the entire group. And it's something that I've noticed, that when the business community and the local government community are here to support housing, that's when we can really drive things and get things done. So I did want to take the opportunity today while you were here to invite folks to talk a little bit about, from their perspective, what about the housing shortage makes things difficult for them to operate their businesses or their government services and provide services in our community. So Stacy will moderate the conversation, but they're each going to start with a few minutes in answering that question, and then she'll be prepared to engage in conversation with the panel, make sure that your board has an opportunity to ask questions, and we have a little bit of a back and forth dialogue. So,
And if a fight breaks out, who's responsible?
that's you.
Okay.
You and Todd, I mean, you're the big guys in the front. We'll be cheering from the sidelines. But I will go ahead and introduce the panel. We've got Jen Sharp, who is the HR director for Squaw Valley Alpine Meadows, one of our larger employers. And then we've got Sean Barclay, who is a general manager for the Tahoe City Public Utility District, providing a variety of sewer, water, recreation services on the western side of the Lake Tahoe Basin area. Then Joy Doyle, who's the executive director of the North Tahoe Business Association, representing small businesses and large businesses alike from Carnelian Bay into the Crystal Bay, Nevada area of the North Shore. And then Mia Kong, who is the vice president of operations for Related California. Related is actually a nationwide organization. Portion of their business is focused on affordable housing development, but she focuses in the California area, so she brings a lot of information about workforce housing development to the table. So
Great.
Go for it.
Thank you, Jennifer. Welcome, panel. I have the pleasure of working with three of y'all pretty intimately on the Mountain Housing Council. Jen and Sean and Joy are part of our Mountain Housing Council. And Mia, I really look forward to working more with you as you have come back to our region. For those of you who don't know, Mia is responsible for the affordable housing that we have in Kings Beach, which is a huge success story. It was built over 10 years ago. It still looks brand new to us. And it's really well received in the community. So thank you so much. So here we are. We have the opportunity to just share a little bit of what reality looks like for us up here with our board. And so that's the first question I'd love to ask Jen, if you don't mind, representing Squaw Alpine. How is this housing crisis impacting your business and your employees?
Thanks. Can you hear me?
No, you got to push the button and bring it a little closer to you. There you go.
Now can you hear me?
Yep.
Hi, thank you for having me. So I'm the Human Resources Director at Squaw Valley Alpine Meadows. As you may or may not know, we employ about 2,700 people over the course of the winter between both mountains. You know, and I don't think it's any big surprise that the impact that we feel with the housing challenges up here is really in recruiting and retaining employees to run our mountains for all of our guests. And it's really sort of a two-pronged issue. On the recruiting standpoint, it's very, very difficult to find housing for seasonal employees in a transient workforce. You know, we talk about achievable housing for families, and that's certainly a very important thing and sort of part of the prong too, but related to seasonal employees, it's very challenging to find a place for people that are only here between 3 and 8 months of the year. That are just critical to our economy and running a business in the region. We make do and have come up with some creative solutions, but it's not nearly enough. In some of our highly seasonal departments, we experience up to about a 25% attrition rate between an offer of a job and an applicant or an employee actually starting because they can't find housing. So I was just pulling some numbers. Of the 3,200 applicants, total applicants we had, these are rough numbers, this season, about 2,500 of them are new applicants. And so if you run that number in some of the departments, that means we're losing literally hundreds of potential people that could work up here and run our mountain, which leaves us understaffed, as some of you may have experienced when you come to our mountain. The second part of the story for us is really on retention, and it's no big surprise that it's a story we hear over and over, that we lose talented, willing, wanting people to work in this community and work for us as an employer because they lose their housing and they can't find something to replace it. And that's really a shame. They may just leave altogether and go, I don't know where. But of course, the other option is they leave and they move to Nevada, to Reno, or to Sparks. And it's just, you know, aside from all the other factors that are involved with that, it's a bummer to see people that are committed to our community that can't stay and want to. So I would say that's the major impact for us.
Thanks, Jen.
Thank you.
Well, and then Sean, you have kind of another angle to this in the sense that as a district, you offer some of the most professional jobs there are. So how does it look for the PUD?
We do. Sorry, can you hear me now?
Mm-hmm.
Okay. Yeah, we do. We have, you know, really well-paying jobs for the most part, but very similar to Jen. I think the way that this is affecting the district is primarily in our recruiting. Whether it's for full-time positions or seasonal positions. So the Tahoe City Public Utility District, we employ about 54 full-time employees. But then during the summer, we ramp up with seasonal staff for our recreation, primarily our recreation and parks department. And it has become increasingly challenging to find seasonal workers during the summer. So, you know, it's impacted our operations as we've had to look at adjusting our salaries in order to try to be competitive and bring in folks from Reno or outside the area. But full-time employees, it has drastically changed the way we recruit because primarily now when we start our recruiting efforts, what we focus on is, have you looked at housing? Because similar to what Jen said, we've learned now from offering positions and then, you know, not having folks not be able to accept those positions because they literally can't find a place to stay. So it's changed the way we try to recruit, but it's definitely challenging. We had a recent employee, luckily that was currently living in the South Shore, but it took 3 to 4 months of concerted effort for that employee to find a suitable housing arrangement here in the area. So that's, you know, I think that's the main impact to the district. It also does have an impact in our emergency response and our ability to respond. So right now, actually about 20% of our employees live within our district boundaries, and even a little bit outside of our district boundary, closer to Carnelian Bay. And about 25% live in Truckee, and then over 50% now live outside of that range, which most of those folks are coming in from Reno. So it does have an impact on our ability to respond in emergency situations, and the district, and thankfully our board of directors and staff have done a great job at implementing technology to make sure that we can deal with those situations remotely. And so we've made a lot of changes in order to try to mitigate those impacts to emergency services, but it's definitely an impact.
Very good, thank you. And Joy, you represent so many of our smaller and medium-sized businesses here in North Tahoe. Can you share what you're hearing through your membership?
Yes, thank you for having me. I guess I would want to add to what we've all already heard and we all kind of already know, which is the fact that not only are the people, the business employers and employees affected, but I'm hearing stories that our local economy is also being affected. More folks are moving out of our area, as we all know, to work here. And so guess where they're spending most of their dollars? Elsewhere. So that's of serious concern. Concern about an eroding community fabric with all of the folks that they're not living here, they're not volunteering, they're not participating in the activities that we have to offer. So just a very scary, unsustainable situation there. Quality of the service that is being provided, because a lot of these folks are either reducing their operating hours or in many cases to provide services to our services to our visitors and our residents. They are working 7 days a week, sometimes without any break at all. And so that is just really affecting the service that we're providing, which is also of concern.
Mm-hmm. Especially when people expect that service when they come to visit.
Yeah.
Right. Thank you. Mm-hmm. Mia, you have such a perspective. It's beyond just this region. I'm curious, just as you hear this, are we in a unique situation? We know there's a housing crisis surrounding us in California, so in that way we're not unique. I'm just curious your thoughts.
Well, so I thank you so much, Stacy and Placer County, for allowing me to be here today. It's amazing what 12 years has done. So 12 years ago is when I first came to Kings Beach to look at doing some housing. And back then, there were no partnerships, really, other than sort of, I think, Family Resource Center, Project Mana, and a few other the social service groups that really recognized the absolute dire need for housing in Kings Beach and for the workforce, and really became revealing to sort of understand the actual complexity of what makes Kings Beach so unique, both, I think, from being an incredibly tight community that has, very unique ways of functioning and how it works and how it thrives, as well as sort of what it puts up with to live up here, I think, in sort of God's beauty. So, in so many ways, I think when I first started talking about Kings Beach, it was an eye-opener for a lot of folks down below the snow line. Like, what? Like, that's Tahoe. You can't be serious. People live like that. And it really became a great education, but at the same time, it also prompted a lot of change. So I just have to say how incredibly impressed I am for the continued partnership that Placer County has continued to have, because you are setting the stage right. So, the last decade has not been wasted on the amount of effort and work and policy moves and strategies and coordination, because that is what it takes. We don't have redevelopment. Back when Kings Beach Housing Now got built, we had redevelopment. We were your last project. The governor didn't take the money away. We were able to invest it in the community for the funds that actually came out of your region. But now it's a new day. We're all struggling with different types of funding. So I've spent the last several years working in Sacramento on various bills. I actually, because of Kings Beach, I passed a law called AB 744, worked with the legislator that reduced parking requirements so that you can actually build housing. That was actually very hard to do in Kings Beach, is to reduce some of the parking requirements. And so there's some state laws now that actually are designed for Kings Beach's transit requirement. Once an hour, That's kind of how I designed it. So Tahoe fits. But what's so wonderful is that now, because housing is a crisis all over the country, I think in LA there's 50,000 homeless people on the streets every single day. 50,000 people on the streets of LA. You know, Kings Beach doesn't have that same dynamic, but you have just as many challenges. So really, it's about all hands on deck, but it's also take advantage of what resources you have. So your leadership in providing land resources on the Dollar Hill side, the Nahas property, is tremendous in terms of looking at that resource and being able to, frankly, create the value out of it and not be afraid of what we call density. Density is not a bad word. It actually, call it like sustainable, call it economically friendly. I mean, you are building, it's the most environmentally friendly footprint you can have, you know, to go vertical. You've got trees that are 125 feet around you. Building 3 stories was like earth-shattering in Kings Beach, but it's 3 stories and it fits perfectly in the neighborhood. But we got 30 units to the acre in Kings Beach, 30 units to the acre, first time ever. And it fits. And so you begin to look at what fits and what these opportunities are. So I implore you to continue your great work. And then as you move forward in seeing how your stuff tees up with the state, there are new funding packages. So last November, not only did we vote in a new governor, we also voted in a $4 billion housing package. And a very aggressive governor who has put all this money into his budget. It's going to be state programs for infill infrastructure, which is what Kings Beach got. So that paid for sewer and water quality, what do we call all those sidewalks in front of Kings Beach and everything you can imagine, bioswales. I mean, all of that Kings Beach and areas like Tahoe are ready for. And it's a matter of making sure the timing is right and the type of project that you're developing fits the state principles. And I think because of your workforce need, because of your amount of jobs, you know, you really have to tee things up. But I mean, that is what your partnership is for. That's what I can help us put together. And we're really looking forward to taking advantage of this time. But I really, again, just have to applaud Stacy, Jennifer, all the people that have been here through the years to continue to push this effort because it is so complex. And I think your region is so complex with Truckee, with Kings Beach, with Placer County, and El Dorado County, and solving the same problems. I actually was on a panel last Friday in El Dorado County. Same type of situation. Housing, we need housing for our workforce. Here are all our businesses. How are we going to do it? One of the things I also threw out to El Dorado County is pilot some ideas. Figure out ways to incentivize the kind of housing, whether it's for sale, whether it's affordable by design, whether it's some kind of income restriction. Pilot it, try it out, see if it works. And just keep saying yes to housing. We may not get it right all the time, but if you say yes, we can at least keep trying. So again, I applaud Placer County and all of your leadership. It's wonderful to see continued leadership on this board, and I look forward to working with you.
Fantastic, thank you. And I know that as the Mountain Housing Council moves forward on their policy platform, we're going to want to stay in connection with you because I think, the more we can collaborate on that, the more we can raise up the kind of legislation and funding opportunities for our region, the better success we're going to have. So going back to our businesses, I'd really love to hear some of the innovative things you're doing to solve your housing problem. I think you're having to get creative, whether it's in asking your applicants, have you thought about housing? Are there some things bubbling up that you guys are working on that you can share? And Joy, for you, since you have access to all these different partners, I mean, we know of businesses that are actually purchasing housing for their employees and just getting super creative. And so I'm going to throw it out to the 3 of y'all, and whoever's ready to talk, kind of jump in.
Okay, thank you. So yes, we have had to get creative, and our employees get really creative too, to find a place to lay their head at night. And sometimes literally that's what it is, a place to lay their head at night. I'll just share a quick story before I talk about our creativity. We just had an employee a couple of nights ago. We found out, we weren't aware of it until recently, that he and his brother, who both work for us, have been living in a van, and they find a place to plug in, and they get chased around all the time, told to leave, told to move. And this is somebody, actually 2 people who are full-time seasonal returning employees here. And I think for them the key is, just as an FYI, it's affordability. It's just really rough to find a place that someone can afford. So some of the ways that we've gotten creative, we do have a full-time year-round housing coordinator on our HR team, and really her only job year-round is to jockey houses and jockey people around the houses and keep everybody in a good mood while doing that, which isn't always easy. So a couple things that we've done, we have 38 on-site housing units, or actually I should say beds, at SQUA, which is great. Those are utilized year-round, summer and winter. During the winter time, we have 6 homes in the area that we master lease through several property management companies, which equates to about 32 beds, pillows really, places to lay down and go to sleep at night. And that's actually worked out pretty well. It is very difficult to obtain those leases though, because as you might guess, most of the property managers want to rent, do short-term rentals for much more money. So we're really lucky to have those relationships. We also do a rental rewards program where we will ask people to rent to our employees, and if they do, we give them a gift card for a certain amount of money, which we're going to up that next year to hopefully get more rental rewards. That's a great situation because that's us incentivizing landlords to rent directly to our employees, and we're not getting in the middle of it in a master lease situation. And then last, we secured, this is new this year, we secured 40 beds, actually all the way over here in Kings Beach, with a landlord that's worked out really well, particularly for our J1 students who are here for such a short amount of time. And to the point that somebody was making earlier about cars and transportation, these kids, as long as you're on a bus line, you're in business. And we can get these employees moving around the area with public transit. And that's been the case with this particular property in Kings Beach. It's right on the line, and it works out really nicely to have them come and go from SQUA, even from over here.
I really appreciate you saying that because we really can't separate how we're going to solve the housing problem without talking about the transportation piece. And the fact that we do have the bus system here is incredibly important, and it needs to continue to be invested in, looked at, optimized for the region because it plays a significant parallel to the housing success. Sean, did you have something to add?
Yeah, I think we're starting to try and dig in right now and figure out what we can do. I think really it's now starting to reach out and find out what other people have done. So I've reached out to our sister agency in Eagle River Water and Sanitation in Vail to find out sort of the programs that they've put in place for their employees. They've done some really impressive stuff. We've continued to work with Mountain Housing Council and looking at maybe potential programs that we could implement as a district for housing assistance, whether that's in down payment assistance or property management, master lease arrangements. We're fortunate in that we don't need to hire 2,700 employees, so it's a little less, I guess, urgent situation for us, but we're starting to dig in right now and really look at what we can do.
That's great. Joy?
I would just say, is it working?
There you
Yes.
go.
I would just say that the North Tahoe Business Association, we're a very small nonprofit organization, and so one of the things we bring to the table with our 200 plus members is a communication channel. We are constantly striving to engage our members and the broader community in this conversation. Everybody talks about it every day, it seems like, but the more we can coalesce, be a part of the Mountain Housing Council, that's critically important. And I just would speak to my own personal experience being a homeowner up here since early 91. Fortunately, my husband and I bought within the first year of living here. What foresight my husband had. I just look around our community, how many houses sit empty. Let's unlock those, what Mountain Housing Council has talked about, and let's figure out solutions, the low-hanging fruit. And I love that you mentioned the density thing. The younger generation does not need big, sprawling units. 375 square feet is plenty of space for them. So don't be afraid.
And I would love to just kind of reiterate that we get the same feedback. There's not only a cultural kind of difference and norm up here, and people really value being outside. When you start talking about space, and this is a generalization, so I apologize, but often what comes up is we want storage for our kayak, our skis, our what we're doing up here. They don't necessarily want the 2,500 square foot house. They're willing to have smaller homes. They don't mind that. In fact, as you just referenced, Joy, the simplicity of this next generation, they don't want as much stuff. They want to commit to a smaller footprint. These are very real conversations when you think about what does the future of housing look like for this region. Mia, I'm curious if you can speak to any innovations around businesses. I want to just kind of lead you into, a lot of times in our community when people get frustrated, they think, well, the employers need to be doing more. But when you hear our panelists and when we hear the reality, those of us who are kind of in the conversation, our employers are doing everything they can, trying to keep their businesses going and afloat with some of the challenges you've heard. But they're also stepping up and creating their own solutions on their own dollar. And so I'm just curious if you have seen other regions do something like this and any ideas that come to mind.
Yes. Well, I think the three tenets of affordable housing development really is public money.
You switch?
Okay. Public funding. So when we have state competitions at the local level, we have to compete. One of the reasons why Kings Beach won in the infill infrastructure grant program in 2008 is because we had significant redevelopment dollars and we could compete statewide. Without that, we can't compete. So just to put it bluntly, you're doing a great job, but we can do a little bit better because, frankly, the buck stops where the buck stops. We need more money. So how do we do that? Places like Mammoth, for example, have done TOT sort of sets aside. Redevelopment, we had a 20% set aside. There are new pieces of legislation that are working their way to be introduced this year in the legislature that will look at some kind of redevelopment type thing. We know EIFDs, infrastructure, enhanced infrastructure finance districts are a possibility, but whether it's, whatever trickle sources we can come up with. I mean, I know we have incredible organizations like the Martis Fund and the airport, the Tahoe Airport. There are pots of money which are fabulous. We need everything, but frankly, we need even more because what is the median home price these days? $800,000? Something like that, right? Rent is at least $2,000. So, I mean, it is unaffordable if you're paying someone $16. Look at the disconnect we have here. People come to Tahoe for the services, for the entertainment, but you actually can't afford to pay them the living wages that they can afford to have the homes. So that's the disconnect. But you realize if we can get better with density, and again, push it back a little bit. Yes, thank you. So density, for example, in Kings Beach, we had transit that was literally 200 feet away, and people were riding transit because, again, population shifts, we're seeing different shifts. So there's great opportunity to start looking at that, but let's not penalize density. We have to go back and support, or look at something different. For example, the state has just put forward SB 35, which is the new streamlining tool that actually requires local jurisdictions to accept certain types of affordable housing based on certain criteria and move it through the process quickly. That level of certainty helps developers understand what's possible. Land resources, I'm looking at SQUA, I'm looking at PUC. What land do you have? Maybe you have some land that could be developed. Having that free land or having that land being donated into the housing makes that equation so much easier. So if you can get a hold of more land, more money, and streamline your entitlements and create certainty, I guarantee you'll start to see some results. Part of it is just making sure that people have a level playing field, that they understand what is required of the housing development. And if we can get creative again with pilots, if you want to test certain things, maybe you say, 100 units of attainable by design for sale housing. Just throwing it out there. That's small lots, exceptions, less parking, so less setbacks, you name it, without having to make that person jump through all the hoops like, someone like me did 12 years ago. So part of it is that whatever doesn't kill you makes you stronger, so I'm here. But the reality is we have lots of tools at your disposal. You have lots of tools from Sacramento to kind of make things happen, but it does take a lot more, frankly, a little bit more effort and a little bit more money to start making things flow. And once you do that, then you start having a little bit more balance where there's more certainty, there's more housing, you have more people riding trains and buses to get up here. I know with Kings Beach, because we were over the VMT on Kings Beach, we had to pay like a $60,000 fee because we were next to transit and there was no incentive for being next to transit. And we actually parked, almost 1.5 parking spaces per unit, but that was a drastic reduction from something like 3.5 that was required at the time. So, those types of shifts, if you kind of clean those up, make it certain, make it clear, you can start to lay out the groundwork for other developers to come in and see opportunities. I love to hear Shauna's sort of example about there's 104 housing sites in Placer County that could be great for housing. How do you incentivize those? They're great opportunities. And if you lay out sort of a suite of incentives, maybe you can get some landowners to play ball and partner with developers like us or other great developers out there in California to actually do some things. Because as long as there is a level playing field and everyone's working together, you're going to start getting some, I think, more activity.
That's great. That's fantastic, actually. And I love that you covered those 3 areas because one of the first things our council did was look at the land, looked at public land, what's available, and then kind of took out the pieces that made absolutely no sense because it was too steep or it was in drainage or whatever. And so we know where those parcels are. We've spent the last 18 months taking on some of those pieces that people would say kind of the silver bullet, if you just fix this, then this would happen. And so we kind of said, okay, we'll look at that. Okay, we'll look at that. And so all the policy pieces are kind of getting kind of touched and looked at and vetted, and our partners are stepping up and crafting that. The funding piece is the big one. And the funding piece is going to take a region-wide approach in a lot of different ways, focused on a myriad of things. And so the soft financing that goes with the truly affordable, it's like squeezing water out of a rock right now to find the money that you need to tap into those state tax credits. The advocacy required to go after those grants that are available. And then finally, not just looking at the funding for the housing developments themselves, but the funding that alleviates the challenges that a family faces if they're about to lose their rental because the homeowners made a different decision on what they want to do with it, and now they're scrambling, or a first-time home buyer. And you're right, we do have these different pools, but they need to be coordinated in a bigger capital strategy. And that's kind of where we're at, and I'm really glad you brought it up because I want you guys to be kind of in lockstep and thinking about that stuff with us. So I'm going to ask the panel one more question, and I'm going to open it up. Oh, go ahead.
Yeah, I do have a quick question. Jen, for your transient employees, if you will, the seasonal folks who are working whatever you consider full-time, what can they afford on a monthly basis for a room, for a bed?
So that's a tricky question because there's a wide range of wages, right? We pay anywhere, for a non-tipped position, anywhere between $13 and $20 an hour for our seasonal roles. So that's a really big range of what somebody can afford. What I can share is that we have some people in housing that are paying hundreds of dollars for a shared bed. That's how bad it is, and they happily take it. That's what's going on. And so, can they afford it? Yeah. Is it a great experience? Is it a great, is that the best we can do? I hope not. But that's what it is right now. I don't know if that answers your question.
Thank you.
Supervisor Euler? Is it okay if I jump in?
Yeah.
I was going to say, I think there are a lot of people that live in Tahoe that make less than $40,000 a year. Just keep that in mind.
Right.
That's very, very common. And those that make more than that are working 2 jobs or more.
Yeah, $20 an hour is $38,400 a year.
Okay, thank you.
Very good. Yeah, go ahead.
You know, affordability is definitely one of the factors, but availability. I mean, that's really, you know, I've been in this community now for almost 20 years, and it's always been challenging to find a place to rent, and more so in the last, 5 to 8 years, probably, it's just become nearly impossible. And so that's why people are jumping at, a chance to share a bed for $100 because that's all there is. The other option is not live here or live in your van.
That's a great point. It's the accessibility, the availability, as well as the cost. But I just want to reiterate exactly what you said, that when there's nothing out there, your expectations might go down a bit to make it happen. People want to be here. They want to work here and be a part of this community. So they'll do what they can to make it.
Agreed. And I would like to add on that availability, there is unlocking, which is absolutely a worthy pursuit. At the same time, we just haven't been keeping up with needing more housing units for a certain kind of local fit. And many of those second homes are people's second homes. It's where they want to come and they want to know that it's their couch and their home accessible to them. And that's wonderful. It drives our economy. It's a bit of the heartbeat of our community. These are community members as well. And yes, we need to work on unlocking that, and there are multiple strategies and conversations happening there. But we also just need to build more units. And many of much of the housing stock that we have here was built before 1979. And so, not always ideal for a budding family or a young professional. And the last piece that has been really eye-opening is the difference between the stick build, building from the ground up, versus the modular. And so there's a lot of new hope as we see some of these new developments pop up, that the community is willing to look at a different type of construction, and that this type of construction actually might start to help us close the gap on the costs to build up here. So it's complex, but I think we have a willingness to look at things differently. So I'm actually now, I would love to just open it up to the board and the panel so that you guys can ask the questions.
I do have a follow-up question, actually, Jen. You indicated that your winter employee base grows to about 2,700. What is it in the summer?
A little less than 900.
Okay.
So I think when we pulled the numbers last year, it was like 876 or something like that last summer. And that's, again, between the two mountains, but primarily Squaw.
Okay. And in the winter of the 2,700, how many of those folks are struggling to find a place to live? What percentage of your employee population is in some way, shape, or form facing that challenge?
I haven't run it by percentages, but again, if we go back to what we know is our true attrition rate, and this is going to vary by department, right? Like, for example, in ticket selling, we employ a lot of local people. So the attrition rate between offer of a job and coming to work is pretty low. But like in lift ops, where we're welcoming a lot of new people every single year, we're experiencing upwards of 25% attrition. And, these candidates are being dispositioned out of our applicant tracking system as housing. So I don't have a percentage, but overall, it's up to 25%. Depending on the department.
So I guess what I'm trying to do is kind of reverse engineer back to if SQUA were able to provide X number of bed spaces on site within the valley, you might be able to solve your own employee housing. Do we have any guess as to what that number is?
Yeah, so I would be comfortable in the 200 to 300 beds. And that is something that we have, that is pending with our development, right?
Right.
The 300, that is 300 beds, mixed use, dorm, single family, recreational areas, new bike paths, so forth. So we're just anxiously awaiting the opportunity to build that, which, by the way, has been sort of a roadblock to us committing, dollars to your point on land or anything off-site, because we want to take care of our on-site project when the time
And I would
comes.
imagine that given the nature of your business, you're going to see your own employee housing primarily utilized November through March,
Yes.
and then it's available for
Yes.
folks who are working in the lake area
Yes.
during the summer months.
Yes, it would be a beautiful synergy.
So I'm going to put you in touch with a company that just built a very nice facility that my daughter lives in at Boise State, brand-new for-rent apartments. They have 295 beds up there. I was speaking with folks up there, thinking about our Tahoe employee situation and thinking about the kinds of housing that they built. My daughter's in a private one-bedroom, one-bath, shares a common living area with somebody else in a private one-bedroom, one-bath, $795 a month. And they're making money.
Yeah,
And they only have the one private one-bedroom, one-bath. They go up to 5 people with a shared common area, and that's closer to $595 a month.
that'd be great.
And like I said, they're making money. And
Yeah.
these are college students. The demographic is your demographic. So.
That'd be great. I would love to see that. Thank you.
Any other board members have any questions or want to tell a story about Boise State?
Stacy,
No?
were you going to ask another question, or were you opening it up?
I think this is a good time, unless the panelists have a burning moment that they just want to share or idea that you want to share. Let me just give you that opportunity. There's a series of questions, but I feel like we've kind of flowed through those questions over the course of the conversation, but I don't want to leave anything off the table before we move. And then I want to make sure if you want to open it to public, we have a chance to do that.
Sure. Supervisor Montgomery, go ahead.
Yeah, so I actually do have a question, and I think it's really probably mainly for Mia. So the governor recently just basically put out a directive that surplus government, state property, was going to get prioritized and entered into a streamlined process for workforce/affordable housing. How do you think that could affect the conversation?
I think it will. Thank you. I think it will definitely help land resources. We're really having a hard time finding land right now as developers around the entire state. Land that's suitable, land that kind of works with the zoning. Even with SB 35, you need to be part of the general plan. You need to have some consistency. So having those land resources are going to be important. But as far as the process right now, there is actually state law that was passed a couple of years ago. Don't remember the bill number, but any surplus land owned by any district, whether it's school district, public utility, you name it, if you declare that surplus, then the number one priority is affordable housing. But quite honestly, a lot of agencies don't want to declare their land surplus.
Right.
School districts are one of those. Because they're like, maybe one day we're going to have this big baby boom and we're going to have 1,000 new students, and so we want to hold on to all this land that, oh, by the way, might be teacher housing. So actually, I had this conversation with Monterey County and their school district, same type of situations. Monterey, beautiful land resources, natural resources, et cetera. They're embarking on something like this where they're looking at all their school sites and trying to build housing for their teachers and workforce and coming up with different partnerships. So, land is absolutely paramount to finding the right land, but also just having that political will to sort of say, let's declare this surplus and let's just move it forward. Let's pick a developer and let's try to get this housing built. So it is critical. But it isn't just a slam dunk right away. It's going to take time.
Yeah, thank you. And then the other thing that I just wanted to address, because I know I hear this a lot, is that the problem with our housing shortage up here is short-term rentals. And while I think that short-term rentals may have somewhat compounded the problem, the larger problem, as I see it as a 30-year resident, is certainly speaking for the community I live in. The community I live in used to be a community where the property owners been in their family a long time. They used it in the summer maybe, but they didn't ski. So in the winter it was a ski lease, or they were skiers. And in the summer it was Back in the 70s and 80s, we called it Governor Brown's climbing team. Again, more recently. So it had multiple uses on and off season. What we have certainly seen in my neighborhood, and I've also seen it in Squaw and North Star and everywhere in Tahoe, is people who had these properties in their family for a long time sold them for a lot of money. And the people who bought them, God bless them, didn't want to rent to dirtbag climbers and dirtbag skiers, And so that took away a really significant portion of our, I'm not going to call it permanent, but longer-term rental opportunities. And then the short-term rental piece did compound that to a certain extent. So I think it's a much larger conversation, I think, than just focusing on short-term rentals or even constructing new housing. We need to figure out a way, and I know we're working on it, so thank you everyone who's working on it, to activate those rentals that are, or those homes that are sitting there empty for 85, 90, 95% of the year. And it's just, it's a tragedy. It's changed all our communities, and from my perspective, not for the better.
Well, also, I think you're right, Jennifer, Supervisor Montgomery. But I think the challenge, too, is that for so many years, this community has built single-family homes, period. That's what everybody wants. You want to get up here. It's your second home. You're skiing. It's a family thing, everything everyone said. So whether it's condos, whether it's fractional, it's all ownership. But yet the needs are seasonal, are transitional. You have all this workforce. So you haven't really been building for the workforce, which is a rental product. Because quite honestly, your system is not set up for the rental project. Because I went through it, it wasn't set up for the rental project. So, for example, your fees are based on per unit. So if you're building 500 square feet, you're paying the same fees as a 3,000 square foot home. There's no setup to incentivize someone to build denser. You're penalized for it. So what actually you're incentivizing people to do is build really big and really expensive, because that's the only way you can afford the fees, frankly. And that's the only way you don't lose your shirt. And so I agree that there's a lot of housing stock, but I think it's really going to be hard to kind of change the dynamics, because quite honestly, I bet people are up to their eyeballs in mortgages, and they're trying to rent out just to kind of make ends meet and make their mortgage payment. So I think that's a resource. There's ways you can strategize that, but you also have to just build. There's nothing to replace the production side of the house, period. Don't fool yourself. You got to produce the units. And you have to say yes to housing. It has to be all kinds of housing, but you got to build dense and lots of units. And it's rental. Frankly, it has to be rental. So you've got to find sort of another temperature gauge on how to get rental housing product to the table. And that's actually the same thing across the entire state. Rental is very hard to get done. Local governments see it as being an impact. You have huge impact fees. I think we paid $60,000 in fees per unit for Kings Beach, for affordable units. You've got TRPA and Placer County to have to go through. It's not for the light of heart. So it really is about how do you get the type of housing that you need and want, and how do you incentivize that? And it isn't large second homes. We know that. And those are never going to be the panacea for all of those 900 summer squaw users, of the 2,700 employees that work at squaw. They need housing units, and they probably don't even necessarily need dorms either, because dorms kind of create a certain sense of, where. And if you want long-term and reasonable people, you kind of need apartments, and you kind of can see how they grow. And I think, the Kings Beach housing project, it was at least a 3.5-year waiting list. I think you have to cap it at 3. The demand was so incredibly tight. All those units have continued to be full. And it's because they're family units. The large majority of those units were families, because the vast majority of the workforce here have children. And that's part of the equation. They're not just ski guys from Australia. They're actually people maybe who fall in love and then have a couple of kids, and now they're here. So, that you're building a community and a workforce, and they need flexibility and reasonable accommodations that they can afford, and that really fits the rental profile.
So quick question. Were you anticipating a close time for either the panel or the overall conversation today, Jennifer?
Overall conversation, I was guessing in the 4 to 4:30 range.
Okay.
So
all right.
We're going to accept public comment probably at some point, but
okay.
At your pleasure, we're happy to move on to George next.
And do we have a guess as to how long George is going to take on his?
That's George is prepared to do whatever you guys would like to do. He's got a fair amount of slides, but can roll through them pretty quickly, and there are some more meaty than others. So.
Okay, then why,
I think really the best practice is what they're doing there.
why don't we do
Go,
this? We could
maybe.
ask the panel just to hang out there, and let's move on to George's presentation. Then when we open for public comment, we've got the benefit of having heard George, and the panel can also be asked questions at that point. Does that work for you? Was there
for everybody?
Yes, my moderator for the fine panel.
Your
here, is
moderator
that-
will actually be leaving,
Oh, okay.
unfortunately. That
Okay.
big grant I mentioned earlier is calling my name.
Okay.
But I do appreciate the invitation, the opportunity to present, and you're in good hands with these amazing folks. I hope you guys don't mind sticking around either. Very good.
Okay, great, thank you.
It's been a pleasure. Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Thank you, Stacy. And Chairman Mueller,
Yeah.
one thing I just want to mention is I've seen George's presentation. It's amazing. We made it last really a long time because we kept asking him questions that then got answered in the very next slide.
Okay.
So I would
So we
suggest that we
might
just
wanna
let
just-
him give his presentation, take some notes.
I think that's a
And
fine
then pepper him with a
suggestion.
million questions.
And given that we can read ahead on the slides, all right, thank you very much. With that,
So,
you want to
yes.
go ahead and introduce them?
Yes, prepared to move on. I would like to introduce George Ruther. He's a housing director with the town of Vail. I think the discussion that he just heard from the panel is probably something he's heard time and time again in his jurisdiction, and why his town council took the actions they did to make some changes to allow him to really focus on housing. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to George. Welcome. Just take that one.
Good afternoon. Thank you very much. George Ruther, I'm the housing director with the town of Vail. Thank you for having me out here. I appreciate the opportunity to come and share at least some of our experiences with you. Jennifer's right. I was sitting back there listening to so much of the conversation here this afternoon and checked my calendar to make sure it wasn't Groundhog's Day, because I feel like we just lived this same conversation over and over. Jennifer's also correct. I had a fair number of slides, and there's a bunch of information I can run through. I'm going to go through these slides pretty quickly, and then we can always kind of go back. But there were three things I did want to share with you as we kind of start this conversation. And that first one being, the availability, and that came up from, I think Sean made this comment, the availability of housing is the number one most critical issue facing the town of Vail. Every other year we do a community survey within our community, and this is a recurring theme. The housing availability has struck everybody in the community, and I think everyone has a personal story that they would like to share, about housing, whether it was their circumstance where they were the ones living in that van with their brother, or sharing a bed with someone, or simply being displaced because of the housing issue. Everyone has a story they would like to share. Prior to taking on this most recent role of housing director, I was with the town's community development department. I've been fortunate to be with the town of Vail for over 20 years now, and I was with the town's community development department when we saw a problem in our community around we refer to ourselves as being a resort community. We're both a resort and a community, and both pieces are important to our conversation. But when we saw and did some work around the resort side of our community, we saw we were on the decline. There were things we needed to do. We set about putting into place a program that over about a 6-year period of time, when I was the community development director, referred to as Vail's New Dawn, we saw an effort get underway where we saw $2.5 billion, billion with a B, $1 billion of private sector money brought into our community to solve what we would say solve the resort side of resort community. During that same period of time, I think the community spent about $27 million of public money towards that effort, always saying that if the private investment came and we were the beneficiaries of that private investment, we would reinvest public dollars back into the community side of things. Well, that's where we're at today. Today we are facing, I think we did a great job of addressing the resort side of resort community. Now we're on the community side of resort community. My presentation today, I want to cover 3 topics kind of in general. One was something we did to kind of spur this effort along, and that was this notion of creating a housing department, and I'll speak a little bit as to why we went with the direction of a housing department. The second is to talk about some housing programs and initiatives that we've put into place. I think those programs and initiatives demonstrate a couple things, and one of the primary issues is I don't think there's one key silver bullet or magic wand that you're going to wave to solve this problem, but it's going to be a myriad of efforts and approaches that are going to help you address the issue. And then lastly, I want to spend some time talking about what I'd like to think of as a pretty innovative program where we're using public dollars to invest in our community in the form of the Vail Indeed program. So with that, I'll run through this information, like I said, pretty quickly with our housing department. I apologize, some of the text is a little bit small on here. But you know, kind of first and foremost, why a separate housing program? And in this case, again, housing remains our #1 most critical issue facing the community. It touches everybody in the community, whether it's an environmental issue, a social issue, or an economic issue. It's an issue that's touching everyone in our community. Without this private, or prior to creating this housing department, we had a situation where housing was a team within the community development department. And while we made some progress in that regards, I'll be the first to tell you that by creating a separate department, we created a whole new kind of focus and emphasis. And in some ways, maybe it was just symbolic, but the creation of this department has caused this conversation to get elevated significantly within the community. Thirdly, I like to share, you know, what you focus on determines what you miss. And in this case, you know, when we're focused in housing was within the community development department, there was a lot of things that we were discussing at the same time. And the housing component specifically within community development was being missed in that conversation. The other issue that came up is I had the fortunate opportunity to be engaged in this conversation with the decision makers about the creation of the housing department. And one of the issues that from my perspective that I shared was, you know, we're only going to be successful if we create this housing program, if we actually, you know, send the message that we're open for business. We're here to get something done. We're not just going to, you know, do business as normal, but in fact we are going to be open for business. And there's some seriousness and leadership behind this notion of we're going to address the #1 most critical issue facing the community. It was a strategic move, you know, to improve our results. That was something I'll share in a forthcoming slide. That you know, when I shared that, there was some conversation about, well, then we're going to create some accountability. You know, there has to be accountability created around this, and we'll need to demonstrate and measure our results going forward. Not only to demonstrate, you know, what changes, incremental changes we may need to make or do as we move forward in this conversation, but actually demonstrate that we're addressing this particular issue. And then lastly, it compelled us to think differently and to be bold about what we were doing. And you'll hear that commentary, I think, throughout much of my remarks this afternoon, and that's this notion of thinking differently. And I'll talk to you about that. And some of the panelists also shared, you know, some of these perspectives as well. The next slide, again, small information, but the key I want you to take away from this slide is, you know, in the town of Vail, we create alignment around the community's vision, and our community's vision is to be the premier international mountain resort community. And you know, we don't say that lightly. It's not just a tagline that goes on our business cards, but it's, I think, something that's believed in organizationally, top to bottom, side to side. That, you know, what we all do in our individual capacities is critical to realizing Vail's vision. Within the housing department, we have a similar mission, and our mission is really, when you boil all that text down, it's really about creating and maintaining community and realizing our vision through the creation of one deed restriction at a time. When you talk about this problem, and as big as this problem is, if you look at it as a big problem, I think you'll be challenged in coming up with solutions. If you look at it, that old adage, you know, how do you eat an elephant? One bite at a time. I think you'll have some additional successes in that particular piece of the conversation. We also talk a little bit about housing department values, and they're listed there on your sheet of information. And you know, some of those values, again, go back to creating this notion in this environment of accountability. This notion, you've heard it talked and shared by some of the panelists, this idea of, you know, we're building homes, not just units. You know, it's quality, not just quantity. All of these things are important, but it's kind of the perspective that you take going forward, I think has impacts on being able to achieve your desired results. Again, just a slide that kind of outlines, you know, we are a department of 2 So today, 50% of the housing department is in Tahoe. The other 50% is back at the office sending me all kinds of emails right about now. But no, it is about, being focused on what it is we're trying to achieve. And again, as this slide indicates, and it's something that we approach from almost a daily basis in our decision making, being that we are such a small department with many different issues coming our way, remaining focused on that mission of realizing Vail's vision, one deed restriction at a time. In fact, I like to share a story around that organizational development side of things. There was some organizational work done back in the late 60s, early 70s around NASA and the work that NASA did, and I've shared this story with some of you in the past. But the conversation goes this way. There was an individual interviewing folks at NASA about, what's your job here at NASA? And folks talked about all kinds of different jobs they had. And I'm the rocket scientist and I do this. I'm a fuel specialist and I do that. And they talked with a gentleman with the janitorial staff and asked what his job was with NASA. And he described his job as being to put a man on the moon. And you think about that, You think about someone who understands what their mission is that clearly, that here's a person who works on a janitorial staff and his job is to put a man on the moon. That's a person who understands what the overall organizational mission is of what they're trying to accomplish. We try to do the same thing within our housing department every day as well. The organizational structure of the department, it's really broken down into policies and programs and then day-to-day operations. And we break that information down into a couple of different components, and those being around policy and program, our Vail and Deed program, something I'll talk about here in a minute. EHU exchanges, that's a program that we've put in place that actually is a way of increasing, I think, the perceived value of deed restrictions to homeowners, and might be a way to help address some of the housing needs, actually using the private sector and those homeowners to actually achieve your goals in your mission. Policy development, program and project construction, negotiations, funding sources, that's always an issue when you talk about this topic, and then serving as the staff to our local housing authority. Day-to-day operations, the other 50% of our housing department at the current time is deed restriction compliance or enforcement issues. These deed restrictions are an asset, they're of value for us in our community. We've amassed enough deed restrictions, well over or nearly 850 of these deed restricted properties in a community of about 5,300 people to date, that those deed restrictions, conservatively speaking, have a real estate value of about $58 million just back to the town of Vail. So that's a conversation I'll get to here in a moment as well. But then also, data tracking, reporting, project marketing, and our lottery resale process. But we were having a conversation over lunch here earlier today, and as this program continues to grow and as we acquire more and more of these deed restricted properties, I think one thing to be mindful of is realize that it has a direct impact on day-to-day operations, because you want to protect and preserve those deed restrictions that you've acquired over time. Again, this slide breaking down just the functions and operations of the housing department, but again, being a department of two individuals, that arrow on the right-hand side of the screen just denotes that at any given time, we're kind of cross-training, we're bouncing back and forth between jobs, roles, and responsibilities. Our housing department budget, this is a conversation that comes up often, is how do we fund these programs, and what are the uses and sources of some of those funds and revenues? We use general fund dollars, we use capital fund dollars, and housing mitigation funds. At this time, we have no dedicated funding source in place for housing. Kind of a double-edged sword in my opinion. With these funds that we collect, about 70% of the town's revenue comes from sales tax. We live and die on sales tax. So when you hear conversations from some of your panelists about the importance of guest experience and customer service, I would suggest to you that as a resort community, at least the way we look at it from a resort side of things, is that is the only commodity we buy, sell, and trade, and that is guest experience and customer service. I mean, when you really boil it down. So if we don't do those things well, 70% of our revenue revenue goes in the wrong direction. We collect about 70% of that revenue in less than 5 months of the year. So you can see how important guest experience and customer service is to our financial strength and support. The other piece I would, add on here, capital fund dollars. We do fund our Vail and Deed program today through capital fund dollars. We use capital funds are collected. We do have a one source of funding that goes into that pool of money from a construction and building materials use tax that provide some of those funds, but about $2.5 million has been allocated this year alone just for the town to purchase deed restrictions, and I'll talk to you about, I think, the importance of that going forward. Overall, I'd almost be embarrassed to show you 2 years ago what percentage housing was of the overall community's budget in the town's operating budget, because I think I was somewhere down there with bumper stickers for the back of cars was, I think, where I was competing for funding dollars. But it is becoming an issue, and we'll see that one going forward. At long-term funding sources, that is something we do need to have. We do need that. While we're well-funded from other pools of money, it's not an economically sustainable approach. We do need monies that are going to be predictable, consistent, and dedicated and ongoing over time if we are going to achieve our housing goals. More importantly, we also need a funding source that is going to withstand and survive kind of political changes, over time as well. Today, I have the opportunity to work with 7 folks who are extremely committed to solving this housing issue on the Vail Town Council, and I jokingly, it's whatever George asks for, he gets within the organization. And while that's not true, it would be nice if it was. But they do support this effort very well. But we are looking at a long-term funding source. In 2019, November, we will probably have a ballot initiative in place that talks about a funding source. And again, this just kind of outlines how our local housing authority is at its earliest stages right now, just evaluating what some of those alternatives and options are. The options, clearly, without going through everyone, is you can create a new tax, put a new tax or a new fee in place. You could reallocate existing taxes or fees that you already are collecting at this time. Or you could create revenue-generating assets. A lot of local housing authorities operate and issue debt and incur debt based upon revenue that they generate off of a revenue-generating asset, such as, in this case, our Timber Ridge apartments in the town. But I would anticipate, and we did something meaning regionally, along with the county, we put in 2016 a ballot initiative in place for a property tax increase on the ballot at the time. And if you're familiar with kind of the geographic layout of Eagle County and the Vail Valley, on the far eastern side is the town of Vail, and the ski resorts associated with Vail and Beaver Creek associated with kind of that resort market industry. And then kind of as you string out to the west, 45 miles to the west down valley, you kind of change in the demographics and who the folks are. And the exit polling at that time, that initiative failed. And that initiative failed for, I think, a number of reasons. But one of the reasons it failed was that on the western end of the valley, there was a very different thinking about whose responsibility it was to address this particular housing issue and this particular housing need. Had there just been an initiative in place for the town of Vail, it is very likely that initiative would have passed. But again, that's all about perception of whose problem this is to begin to address and how we're going to address it kind of regionally and across the spectrum. That kind of takes us to housing programs and initiatives. We have a number of tools in place, and I'll talk to you for just a few moments about those. One of the first being in late 2016, early 2017, we adopted the Vail Housing 2027 strategic plan. This strategic plan, I think, is important for a number of reasons. And I heard it in so much of this conversation today. And you do need to know, this is the conversation. I mean, a lot of the answers, I think, are in the room here. When I was back here in October, a handful of people, asked me, what's the secret sauce? Can you share the secret? When are you going to give us the recipe? And I'm like, I don't have the recipe. What I have is the answer that I would share with you is the answer that we had in place at the time in Vail, which was the answers in the room. It's the people in this room are going to be the solution to your problems. But in this case, a couple things came out of the Vail Housing 2027 master plan or strategic plan that I'd like to highlight. And that was, for the first time, we started talking about this problem being much more than workforce housing or employee housing or affordable housing or whatever you want to call it. And we started referring to it as it was a bigger issue, and that bigger issue was about maintaining and sustaining community. And we kind of elevated the conversation a little bit higher than because I think than just on workforce or employee housing. Because when we talked about workforce and employee housing, the conversation immediately went to, well, if it's employee housing, it's the employer's responsibility. It's not my employee, it's their employee. I'm not here to subsidize their business. Same thing, with workforce housing. Or when we talked about it solely as affordable housing, we all heard the conversations. Well, I pulled myself up by my own bootstraps. Why can't they? And it just distracted the conversation. So we got into a different conversation. And it really was the conversation or the direction we always wanted to go, which was about community, but we didn't address it that way. Our solutions were always more down in the weeds. And so in this case, we said, well, we want to talk about this problem being maintaining and sustaining community. Because if we do that, then we solve the rest of the issues that kind of fall under that umbrella. And it's really about supporting resident housing in the town of Vail. We speak about it now as being resident housing. The way we set up our deed restrictions, we get what we want. We just call it something a little bit different. And in fact, we're getting better results, I think, because we're looking at the problem fundamentally different than we had in the past. The housing plan was pretty simple, and I share this often, but it's about and there's copies of this I shared with Steve, and he has a thumb drive with all sorts of information that I've loaded to that thumb drive and I'm going to be referring to during my presentation. But in this conversation specifically, there is a copy of that plan on that thumb drive, and if you look at it, it's about a 15-page document, and the majority of the document is pictures, graphs, and et cetera in the document. Not a lot of words, in there. And our purpose was to be clear and concise about what our objective was and what our intent was, and to really get to the root cause of the problem. When we talked about it, it was kind of easy as 1, 2, 3. We just simply had to have a goal, a means, and a method. In my next couple slides, we'll talk about the goal, means, and methods. In this case, the goal was pretty straightforward, and that was to acquire 1,000 additional deed restrictions by the year 2027. We were starting in 2017 with about 700 deed restrictions, so that means by 2027, our job is to have 1,700 deed restricted properties. Additional deed restricted properties available to the Vail community. Today and after the first year, you can see we've put about, these are actual recorded deed restrictions, and we have more that are entitled and on their way right now, but we've added about 140 additional deed restrictions in the first year, and I'll talk to you about one program that's currently in place. I think we have the numbers, we have another 117 plus another 39, so we have well over 200 homes in the first year being developed and put into place. Some of that simply because we said we're open for business, and we made it clear we're open for business. The means is the money. Without the money, we can't achieve our goal. In this case, the means is housing program funds, capital funds create the deed restrictions. And at the end of the day, the deed restriction is what we want, no more, no less. And I'll again speak to that here in just a moment with our Vail and Deed program. And then the method. This was the tricky part. This was the piece of it. This was the conversation I think you heard from some of your panelists. The process is really hard. The decision-making process is fraught with uncertainty, unpredictability, and all sorts of, from a developer's perspective, I think the one thing they often share is about the only thing they know is when the process starts, because that's when they submit their application. Once they submit their application, it's out of their hands, and they have no idea where it goes from there, how long it's going to take or what it's going to look like when it comes out of the development review process. Well, in this conversation, we spoke about, that was part of the problem, was the decision-making process was contributing largely to our inability to acquire the deed restrictions that we needed. And it focused around, in this case, in some instances, the Vail Town Council themselves. Being a board with the wide range of obligations and responsibilities they have as a town council at any given meeting. They could be talking about a special event, allocations for new snowplows and buses and employee compensation and a myriad of issues, plus listening to public comment and taking in all of this kind of information. And then we'd look at the clock and it was 10 o'clock at night and we'd have a housing issue that was on the agenda and we'd have, 15 minutes dedicated to it. And you can't get anything accomplished my opinion, at that time of the day. So we needed a process that was single and focused, proactive, empowering, results-oriented, and was nimble enough to actually get the goal achieved that we sought out to put in place. And we largely saw in this case the town council not being a valuable contributor to that process. So our local housing authority nominated me to go up to the dais and share with the town council that they were part of the problem and they needed to step aside so they could be part of the solution. And we actually did that. We did it in a very respectful sort of way, but I think it was an indication of the town council and the leadership's willingness to again look at this problem differently and look for a different type of a result. So they created a decision-making structure where the Vail Local Housing Authority is granted agency on their behalf to make decisions on behalf of the town council and the community under parameters, and we'll talk about some of that stuff, but it was this willingness to fundamentally change the way we had been doing business within the community, and thus far they haven't pulled the rug out from underneath us yet. So I only put this slide up here because if you do get a chance to look through that strategic plan, you'll see that, again, like I said, it was a 15-page document with lots of words and graphics, so not a lot of text, but what text is in there is text that speaks to, actionable and achievable in getting things accomplished, timely and efficient. Entrepreneurial is one of the, the words that's used in there, and taking an entrepreneurial approach to addressing this housing problem, because we also acknowledge that the private sector and what the private sector does, they are going to contribute significantly to helping us address this problem. The private sector is very entrepreneurial in its approaches, and we needed to do the same thing from kind of a local government perspective as well. This notion of holistic approach, it's going to take many different tools in considerations to actually achieve the results that we were after. You also see accountability up there. That's one that we put into play here because we have to be accountable for the results that we're putting in place and trying to create. I mean, that's really why we're all doing this, this type of work. Housing policy statements. This was something that came out of the strategic plan, and this was, again, a notion of, the developer or the community trying to understand, well, what is it the town is seeking to do, and how are you going to go about it? It's kind of taking the guesswork out of why we do what we're doing. And again, these policy statements really just articulate the approaches the town council and the town of Vail will take when it comes to addressing this issue. The first and foremost on this list, I won't go through every single one of them, but the one I think that was most important and has resonated the most is in Vail, we look at housing as infrastructure. It's no different than roads, bridges, streets, schools, fire departments, et cetera. Housing is infrastructure. If we want to be something more than just a resort, and we've all been to those places, there's one not too far from us in Vail. In fact, it's about 8 miles down valley that, go there in May and it's essentially a ghost town. There's nobody there. There's nobody around. It's not a community. They don't want to be a resort community. They want to be a resort, and that's fine, but that's not what the town of Vail wanted to be. The town of Vail wanted to be a resort community. So without this infrastructure, this housing component as infrastructure, we were never going to kind of realize that overall vision of being the premier international mountain resort community. We also understood with policy number 2 that housing takes partnerships, and those partnerships are collaborative with other governmental agencies, both regionally, within the county, as well as with the private sector, which kind of leads us to that third policy statement around the private sector importance. And in your packet of information, it may be in the documents that were shared with you, but if not, it's on the flash drive that Steve has. There's some meat that goes around each one of these policy statements. And again, that private sector helped us address the resort issues that we had. I am fully convinced the private sector, given the right environment, in a supportive environment, the private sector will step in and help you address this problem. But again, you heard from some of your panelists about what some of those issues are and why maybe the private sector isn't so eager, to jump in and engage in addressing this particular issue. Number 5 is breaking down the barriers. I think Shauna shared some of that in her information. My experience with the Community Development Department tells me first and foremost that there are things that we can do differently and we can do better. When we saw that $2.5 billion of private sector investment back into our community, believe me, we didn't upstaff, in size significantly over a 6-year period of time to go through those development applications. But it was absolutely clear and imperative that we fostered an environment so that that private sector investment would come into the community and we would see the results coming from that. You couldn't do the process. You always hear it, but it's the process, it's the process. You could not do the process in that environment the same way and go through that number of applications, $2.5 billion. I think in 1 year alone, we did almost $600 million in construction valuation in 1 year alone in a community development department of 16 individuals. You fundamentally have to change the way you're going to do business to get a different result in this case. So breaking down the barriers, we have a long ways to go in this regard, but there's plenty of opportunities. The analogy I like to use when I talk about this, because some people talk about it as being, well, we need a fast track process or we need some new kind of process. And I would suggest, I'm not sure that you need a fast track process as much as you need a timely and efficient process. And the analogy I like to share is if you ever watch closely in a baseball game, when a batter hits a home run, they hit the home run, the umpire stands up and the crowd cheers and the batter, tosses the bat in the air in celebration and then he or she lopes around the bases, right? Touches first, second, third base. If you watch closely, the scorekeeper doesn't put the score on the board until the batter actually steps on home plate and the umpire signals for the score to be put on the board. That's what I'm talking about here. I'm not suggesting creating a process where you run from first to third and you skip second base altogether, because there are pieces of this conversation that are very important, especially around that community engagement and public participation. But what I am suggesting is you don't have to walk around the bases. You can lope around, you can stride around the bases, but you go around the bases, make sure all those boxes are checked, and then make sure you step on home plate so that you finish that process and the score can go on the board. Couple of the other ones that I would share is just the last one. Funding is policy. If we talk about wanting to address this issue but putting very little to no money towards it from a funding perspective, you're going to get the same results you had been getting when you didn't fund it. So we need to come up with ways to fund these programs and these initiatives. Other housing programs and initiatives, again, I won't go through each one of these. Do want to highlight a couple, however, that I think are more important or have been more effective than others. For example, residential linkage and inclusionary zoning. I think everybody understands what those are. They're kind of reactive tools that we put in place, and we assess those against private development. And as a result of that, the incremental increase in demand that's created because of those developments, they provide a housing component or a fee in lieu payment or some assemblage of the two. And in this case, but you think about it, in Vail, for example, our inclusionary zoning and commercial linkage requirement is a 30% obligation. So that means as a developer, if I come into the community and I cause 10 new jobs to be created, I have a requirement to provide housing for 30% or 3 of those new jobs that's been created. And that sounds great, right? Right up until you're one of the 7 that didn't have a place to live. And in fact, if you think about it, it's almost an exponential type of problem that we're creating. So, and if you are successful in having a 100% mitigation rate, good for you, but good luck, actually seeing that. So we need tools that address that side of the issue, but also are more proactive in their approach and not just reactive and actually achieve some different results. One of these that I think has been very effective for us is we created a housing zone district, and quite simply said the housing zone district creates or establishes some of that predictability and understanding that's created. The only thing that's allowed as a permitted use in the housing zone district is deed restricted housing. That's the only permitted use. So if a property gets zoned to the housing zone district, you know as a developer what your opportunities are for developing in that zone district. But we also created enough flexibility within some of those development standards so that parking requirements could be responsive to actual location along transit lines or type of residence being created. We also created, provisions around density. We talk about, I think Mia was talking about density. We talk about it as being density done right. Density for density's sake can be problematic, but density done right can actually fit very well into the fabric of the community, and that's really what you should be seeking. But in this case, rather than saying it's 10 units per acre, 20 units per acre, 30 units per acre, it's more of a performance-based approach where you as the developer come in and propose your circumstance and demonstrate compliance with a set of criteria, and we will grant you that additional density if it fits into the fabric, of the community. But we're going to be a little bit more flexible in the approach. The housing credit program. There are opportunities, there are opportunities that come up where, we're seeing this now where a developer has an obligation to provide housing for a myriad of reasons, but the opportunity actually exists to build more housing than was otherwise required to meet their development impact. And the last thing we want to do is turn that individual away and say, I know your impact is 10 units, so you're building 10 units, but they really want to build 20, and they want to preserve that credit for a future obligation or a future use. And in that I would just encourage you to think about that from, these deed restrictions have a value on them, both to the private sector and to the public sector, and think about how that value can be used to actually create more deed restricted properties as you go into the into that approval process or into consideration. One of the things that we see, in Vail, I would say because we have been nearly 100% built out, we don't have any land area to build in. Everything we see is infill or redevelopment opportunities. We do see developers or property owners acquiring property at today's market rate with an intention to maybe do something with it in the future. By having a credit program in place like this, they can actually protect and preserve their investment into the future because you can buy those credits or acquire those credits today and apply them at some point in the future. Something to think about. The Vail and Deed Restriction Acquisition Program. This is a program that we put in place because of the problem that you see up there on the screen today. And the problem is this. In the center part, in that center circle, we have about 5,300 year-round residents living within the community. Those residents, those are the year-round residents, they live in either that 1,750 occupied homes that's on the left-hand side of the screen, or the 700 deed-restricted homes that's on the very bottom portion of the screen. However, in the town of Vail, we have about 7,200 total dwelling units within the community. So that means on the right-hand side of the screen, those 4,800 unoccupied homes, those are all second homes, vacation homes. In fact, many of those are third, fourth, fifth, sixth homes that you see. But what we understood was in Vail, because I mentioned a moment ago, we're 100% built out. If you've been to Vail, we're in the bottom of a very mountainous valley. We have very little opportunity to expand our municipal boundaries. In fact, we have zero opportunities to expand our municipal boundaries. We're surrounded by U.S. Forest Service property around all of our boundaries. We have two ways in. You can come over Vail Pass, over 11,000-foot pass, and come into Vail from the east, or you can come through the canyon to the west of the communities. But it may as well be a drawbridge, or bridges coming into our community, very constrained by land. And in this case, with land being a scarce commodity and a barrier to us getting more affordable homes built or deed-restricted homes built, what we found was 9.5 times out of 10 that when any one of those 1,750 occupied homes sold, more than 9.5 times out of 10, that's a lot. More than 9.5 times out of 10, those homes sold not to another like person, but actually sold as a vacation type of property. And once those homes move from an occupied home to an unoccupied home, vacation property, rarely if ever did they come back the other direction. But we needed a way to protect and preserve those homes for a couple of reasons. One, we are not going to build our way out of this problem. solely. We couldn't build enough homes within the town of Vail to solve this issue. Two, each one of those homes comes on a piece of land. Every time we get a deed restriction, we not only get a deed restriction on the unit specifically, but we also get a covenant on that particular piece of property. And if you follow the thinking with a deed restriction, a deed restriction is really a covenant, and it's a covenant that runs in perpetuity with a particular piece of property, and perpetuity is a really, really long time. When you think about it, really long time. And we are, and by being a beneficiary of that covenant, we get to say when it comes and goes. We can release those covenants. We do it rarely, if ever do we release that covenant, but we do it under certain circumstances. But you can see once the town acquires one of those deed restrictions in that covenant, we protect ourselves going into the future. And it's almost a form of land banking around some of this property. So that was the problem. This was our solution, Vail and Deed. And this was really a program about purchasing deed restrictions, not the whole unit, not the whole property, just a deed restriction or a covenant on the property. And it was really about investing back into our community. And I apologize, these numbers came across so small on this slide, but I'll kind of walk you through each one of them. To date, this program has been in place for about a year now, a little over 9 months now, and we have acquired 105 additional deed restrictions on existing properties within the town of Vail. Our total expenditure on those properties is about $6.5 million. And on the surface, while that sounds like a significant amount of money, $6.5 million of taxpayer dollars invested back into the community around deed restrictions, just to share some perspective, we recently being the town of Vail, recently did a 32-home townhome development in Vail, modular type of construction, 11-month duration. We own the land. We put the land in the site access and infrastructure costs into the development. And then we sold the homes back to the future homeowners with a deed restriction in place at cost. Total project cost was about $22 million. We captured about $18 million back in total cost. So we put about a $3 million subsidy in the form of land and site access and infrastructure improvements into 32 homes. Here's an instance where for $6.5 million, we acquired 105 deed restrictions at an average cost of about $62,000 per deed restriction. That's an average cost, so I have some numbers that for various reasons are a little bit skew that number low and some that are a little bit high, but I think the most that the town has, or the housing authority has authorized in the purchase of a deed restriction is $162,000. And while that sounds like a lot of money going out to the door to preserve this deed restriction, a couple things to think about. It comes with no development risk. It's immediate in its approach. That $162,000, using the most extreme and most expensive example that I have in place, we acquired a piece of land. I would suggest to you, we acquired a piece of land in Vail, Colorado for $162,000. And I'll talk to you in just a couple of moments about another project we're looking at where the land cost is greater than $52 per square foot by comparison.
Before you move off that slide, can you hit on the gray box right under the Vail and Deed logo?
Sure.
Because I think to me, this is the most intriguing piece of what you guys are doing.
Sure.
Very different approach than we've done with deed restrictions.
Yeah, absolutely. In the gray box that you're referring to there is no price appreciation cap that's put in place on these particular deed restrictions. There are other forms of deed restrictions that we have where we do have a price appreciation cap, and that price appreciation cap is anywhere from 1.5% per annum up to 3% per annum. Those are kind of the two ends of the spectrum. But in this case, there is no price appreciation cap because with this program, we don't care particularly about who owns the property. This is really a program about who resides and occupies and lives within the home. So, for example, we have in this Vail and Deed program, we have sold to a wide range of we've bought from a wide range of sellers. Anything from first-time home buyers, folks and families who, as they share with us in testimonials, without this program, we would not be able to afford to live in the town of Vail, and it makes that living in the town of Vail possible. We have no family size, requirements associated with this. We used to kind of have that conversation as well, and then we found all sorts of unintended consequences coming along with this family size conversation. And then lastly, there's no income cap limit. And that was, I'll admit, that was a bit controversial at the time, especially if you look at your problem as being one of simply affordability. As I think it was Sean that was pointing out, questioned this notion of availability. From our perspective, definitely affordability is a problem, but so is affordability, or excuse me, so is availability. And in this case, availability, just simply having a place to live so people are not living in the van that we heard references to, or in our case, we have parking structures in the town and people living in their cars in the parking structure because it's cheaper to pay the daily rate to live in your car than it is to live somewhere else, which is a sad testimony to a lot of things. But this is a very different program about, it's not who owns the property, it's about who occupies and resides within that property, which is why there's no income cap limit. Additionally, I would share, in many of the conversations that we have around this particular topic is that I saw a number in one of the earlier presentations about looking at this problem up to 195% of area median income. We actually take it north of there as well, because we find that folks even north of 250% of AMI, still part of our community, but a part of our community that's lost and is missing in this entire conversation around housing. This pie chart just kind of breaks down those 105 deed restrictions that we've acquired, and there's a couple things that are of note about that. 73% of these homes are studios and one bedrooms. And, some folks have come along and said, well, sure, this is great, 105 homes in the first year. You're just picking all the lowest hanging fruit. Well, yeah, in some regards we are, but I'd also suggest to you that there was nobody there to pick this fruit had this program not, been put in place. So, I get that and I understand that. And, if you're really talking about, I hear the comment all the time, well, if you're really talking about creating and maintaining and sustaining community, studios and one bedrooms don't do it. And I'm quick to point out that when my wife and I first moved to Vail, we lived in a one bedroom apartment. We don't live in a one-bedroom apartment anymore. Lifestyle changes and things happen over time, but if you're going to have community, you have to have a wide range of housing product and housing availability to meet that intent. The larger homes that we see are primarily owner-occupied. Types of residences that we see in town. We do have employers. I heard that conversation come up from the panel. We do have employers stepping in to take advantage of this program. And the conversation does, again, arise, well, if they're already an employer and they already own this particular piece of property, why would you pay them to deed restrict this property? They're already achieving your results. They are, right up until that property goes on the market for sale. And 9.5 times out of 10, they don't sell it to another employer like themselves. They'll sell it outside the market. So it's about protecting and preserving those properties. The smaller employers are the ones that are typically buying some of the larger homes as well. And they're actually stepping in as employers to buy these homes to provide housing for their employees. I'd be remiss to suggest we've never had this conversation about, and again, whose responsibility or whose obligation this is to address this housing problem. But with a program like this, we actually make it conducive and affordable. We were also questioned at the time about, well, are we going to, just end up with all of this housing opportunity and housing stock in certain areas in the community? And what we've seen, again, just with these first 105 transactions, they're dispersed pretty evenly across the community. If you've been to Vail, they're not on Forest Road. They're not on Beaver Dam Road, where the homes are $30 and $25 million, but they are dispersed, within the town. More importantly, though, what you end up with, at least from my perspective, is a good percentage of these buyers of these deed restrictions or sellers of these deed restrictions that we're participating with are homeowners, people who want to invest and buy a home within the community, and they're actually picking out the home that they want. We had a program in place, a buy-down program, where we'd go out and we'd spend $600,000, we'd buy the house, we'd place a deed restriction on it, and then I'd go to resell it. in what would happen. It was too big, it was too small, it was too close, it was too far. I wanted Eastvale, not Westvale. I don't want to be this close to the bus route. I wish I was closer to there was always something wrong with it. So this program really came about as an opportunity to say, you go pick the house you can't live without, and we'll buy a deed restriction from you. And our cash outlay is no longer $600,000, but instead something just north of $100,000. This bar chart just kind of shows the number of units in bedrooms. Again, we do see a preponderance of studios and one bedrooms. That's largely around the resort market that we are. That's where our demand is. That's where our need is. I think we heard that from Jen a few moments ago. That's largely where these issues are at. But we're also questioned by, at the time, by some of the policymakers about, well, if this is really a numbers game, getting 1,000 deed restricted units, the quickest way to do it is to get 1,000 studios. We're on to you. We see right through you. But you can actually see we're getting larger homes through this program as well. On the right-hand side of the slide, those are numbers that just kind of indicate when I use a number of $295 per square foot on average for construction costs, that is as basic hard costs as you can get. That's labor and materials, nothing more, built into that number. You kind of fully load that number, and it's well north of $350,000, $350 per square foot. Add in that land cost at greater than $52 per square foot, and you're talking about construction prices north of $400 a square foot without any soft costs built in. You're going to struggle to be successful building your way out of this problem with those kinds of costs. Why Vail Indeed? Again, it preserves and protects existing homes in the community. We found it to be more cost effective than just straight out subsidies. It was an investment in real estate. Whereby we're converting cash assets into real estate assets. I have this conversation all the time with our finance director, and we both beat our heads over this, and she goes her way and I go mine. But, we do talk about, we're not just spending money, we're investing money. We're spending the town's liquid cash. We understand all of that, and we're creating a real estate asset. But those real estate assets have value as well. We have a deed restriction exchange program in place because we do acknowledge from time to time there may be somebody who needs to get out of a deed restriction. So we want to grant them that opportunity to do so, but it doesn't come at a cost to them. We just recently exchanged an EHU in the town of Vail on a cash in lieu approach where we're buying deed restrictions for $62,000 per average. We sold one deed restriction in this case for just shy of $250,000, $250,000. So, I quickly remind our finance director that if she'd just give me all the money and if I could increase it at a 4X, she'd be more than happy with the outcome. There's no development risk. If you've been in the development business, and I think Mia can share this with you, development risk is a reality. In the town of Vail, we kind of like to avoid development risk. We are, again, spending the taxpayers' dollars, and if we can avoid development risk, that's a real consideration. NIMBY resistant. I wanted to say NIMBY proof, but I'm not sure anything is NIMBY proof these days. But it is NIMBY resistant. When we're talking about deed restrictions and buying deed restrictions on existing homes, there is no development impact. There is no additional construction impact. There is no additional traffic and density impacts. We're simply changing who can occupy that home going into the future. It creates home ownership opportunities. It appeals to a wide range of sellers. Like I said, we've had everything from existing homeowners all the way up to business owners and first time and second and people who are making their second or third home purchase in their lifetime, participate in this program. A deed restriction by its very nature is a long-lasting solution, as that deed restriction again runs with the land, and that runs in perpetuity unless the town participates and says otherwise. It supports a local homeowner market that we wouldn't have without a program like this, in place. And I think I heard some of those conversations about in your area as well, as those families sell those homes. We're not getting back into them. They're going outside that market. And lastly, it achieves our objectives. When it comes to determining the acquisition price determining whether we're going to make an acquisition and what that price should be, I would simply say this. The town council didn't grant their agency to the housing authority without, some strings attached, and we did create 9 criteria around that decision-making process, and they use that in each one of their transactions and conversations when it comes to determining whether they're going to make an acquisition. Today, I would say about 70% of our applications are approved for purchase. About 30% are denied or not accepted. We don't always come to terms on the price with the seller to acquire that deed restriction. But more importantly, we also talked in this decision-making process about, well, how are you going to determine the value of a deed restriction? In like every good government, we said, well, it must be simple. We'll just standardize it. A plus B equals C, and that's, we apply that equally across the board, and there you have it. It's fair, it's easy, it's all of those kinds of things. But we also then kind of looked and said, this is a real estate transaction, and like any other real estate transaction, there's many other factors that contribute to the value of something. So we took kind of the willing seller, willing buyer determines fair market value approach to these homes, or excuse me, to these deed restrictions. So we do use comparable sales. We don't have much of a database, nor did we have much of a database when this program started, but it's continuing to grow, and we're using that information. But like I said, about 7 out of 10 times, we do come to a place where we have a negotiated willing seller, willing buyer price on these deed restrictions that are put in place. Looking back, some lessons learned. This was a program that when I took it to the town council with the housing authority back in 2016-17, and being like all good decision makers, they said, well, that's a great idea. Go tell me what they're doing in Park City, and go tell me what they're doing in Whistler and Jackson with this program. And the answer was pretty simple at the time, which was we can't, because no one else is doing this program. So what we asked for was, again, we need you to think differently. We need you to take a little bit of risk. We're not asking you to jump out of an airplane without a parachute, but we are asking you to take a little bit of risk to try something new, try something different, because if we continue to use the same tools we've been using all along, we're going to get the exact same results that we've been getting. So looking back on it, some lessons learned and some tweaks maybe that we're making is this is an investment. An investment of a deed restriction is a real estate asset. We still own that asset. It's real, it has value. Assemble your legal documents and engage a title company. This is all about transaction and ownership interest in a particular piece of property. With that covenant, we are taking a very small ownership interest in this particular piece of property. You want to make sure that deed restriction survives a lot of circumstances that can happen when properties transfer and whatnot. So being thorough with your legal documents, I think, is important. Partner with local lenders and realtors. When we started this process around deed restrictions, we expected we were going to be accepting deed restrictions on existing properties that somebody already had a mortgage on in place. And to do so, we were going to need the lender's support because, as you see down towards the end of that list, we want to ensure that we're always in the first and prior position in the chain of title on this property, and we wanted to make certain that our lenders kind of understood that scenario. So in a situation where an existing property owner, maybe somebody already owns a home in Vail, but they're scraping to get by, and they have a choice to sell out and move down Valley or go somewhere else because they just are tired of the financial burden associated with that and could sell us a deed restriction. We needed to address this problem in a way so that we could be in the first and prior position. And I shared with the group this morning, I went over to our attorney's office and I shared with him, this need. I had a need for a subordination agreement. And the subordination agreement had to go to the lenders. And the lenders had to sign this agreement acknowledging that they would subordinate their lending to our deed restriction so that in the case of foreclosure, we would always be protected against losing that covenant or that restriction in place. And at the time, our attorney, if you knew him, you would appreciate this even more. He said, well, George, when you get a lender to actually agree to that, you jump right back on your unicorn and you slide down the rainbow into my office and I will fill you out a subordination agreement, and we'll get that done. About 3 weeks later, I walked back into his office, told him I hitched my unicorn up to the post out front, and I needed a subordination agreement. And it was really a conversation with the lenders, just getting their buy-in and understanding that in a resort market, we are very different in a resort market than other places, and this is kind of the norm going forward. So if you want to compete and play as a lender in this market, you're going to have to be responsive to what the needs are in that market. And we got a lot of that stuff put in place in doing so. Fund the program and be prepared for participation. That was something that was of surprise to us. The first time this project was funded, it was funded with about $500,000 from the town council. And they said, if you spend this in the next year, come back to us and we'll grant you more money. I think I was back to them in just over a month with a request for more money. They gave us another $1 million, and I think we spent that in the next 3 months. And then they said, now this time, if you still spend, we're being successful, give us some more. And they actually, granted or appropriated additional funds in that place. Those are kind of all my remarks. I did just want to share kind of in closing, and I'll wrap this up real quickly, just one or two other perspectives. We talked about the organizational structure of the housing department and some of those issues. We talked about the overview of our housing programs and initiatives, shared a little bit of in-depth, or maybe more in-depth than you wanted to hear, about the Vail and Deed program, but it is a program that has been very successful for us. And again, if nothing else, and I share this often, it may not be a plug-and-play type of scenario, but it does demonstrate that through, creating a clear vision and a commitment to your values, thinking differently, willing to be bold, taking on a little bit of risk, you can actually achieve many of these results that you've put in place. And being solutions-oriented, getting the right people at the table. And some of this conversation, it was simply getting the right people at the table to have this conversation and actually listening to one another. I was sharing an example this morning where we were having a conversation at one point where we were all saying the same thing. We were just talking past one another. Nobody was really listening to one another, and we were talking past one another. And the second we started to listen to one another, we understood what the issue was, and just that quickly we solved the problem, because we now understood everyone's perspective and where they were coming from. And then lastly, like I said, be empowering. I'm thankful to work for an organization, from my perspective, that is willing to take some risk in some of the things that we do, because we have to get some different results. And then is also an organization that really fosters this notion of creating an environment of getting to yes. You heard that a moment ago. If we start with no, we're human beings, we're going to get no. If we start with yes, there's a greater chance than not that we'll end up with yes. So with that, thank you for your time. I appreciate it, and I can answer any questions you have.
Board members have any questions of George at this time? Jennifer?
Well, I want to start by thanking George for coming out again. This is the second time I've heard his presentation, and I'm really, frankly, more excited about it now than the first time I've heard it, because I've had a few months to kind of think it over and think what the applications could look like in Placer County. And just as a little bit of background for our board here, I really wanted George to come back, because I really want us to do what he just said, which is to be bold and to really take a very proactive approach to this huge struggle that we're all having around housing in Placer County, not just here in eastern Placer County, but throughout the whole county. And I think some of the things that Vail has done, have been incredibly bold and just filled with great foresight. And the thing that was so important to me was that focus on community and recognizing that this is what builds and keeps strong communities. And we all are so frustrated throughout the county by the loss of community that we see, because we see so many people who can't afford young people to move into our communities. We see people in our second home areas like eastern Placer County where people are just moving out. And that means that the small businesses that Joy represents don't have people who live here and work here year-round, full-time, to go buy a dozen eggs or, buy all the other things that we need here. And I'm hopeful that when we're done having this complete discussion, and when Jennifer, I think, and Shauna are going to do a little tiny bit of wrap up at the end, but that we can have a really comprehensive conversation as a board about where do we want to go from here? What are the next steps that we need to take? And, I'll just preview my thoughts on that. And that is, we need to stand up some kind of housing entity that does this full-time, year-round for not just Placer County, but the town of Truckee and Nevada County and all the other special districts who need to be on this as well. We have a housing authority in Placer County. It may or may not be the appropriate vehicle for this, but we need to at least hire some folks and get some dollars allocated to really focusing on that. Jennifer and Shauna have done an astonishing job, frankly, kind of shoehorning all of this stuff into their already very full plates. And I think we owe it to ourselves, we owe it to our communities to say, we're going to actually, in our next budget next year, allocate for staff, allocate for time, allocate for research, and make sure we get this stood up. And one of the things, as a board member that I love about the Vail model is that his city council essentially stood down. And we all have an enormous amount of things on our plates, and I think an opportunity to hire some really competent people with the right motives and the right direction and some oversight. I think that's really critically important for us moving forward as well. So, at the end of this, I'm just going to say that we're going to need to allocate real dollars and real staff to this and figure out how the town of Truckee can help us with it. I see Truckee here today somewhere, or maybe he left. There you are. Hi. And Nevada County needs to be a part of this because this is a regional issue. This is not a Placer County issue. It is not a Squaw Valley issue. It is not a PUD issue. It's all of us. So I'm going to shut up now and let somebody else ramble.
All right, thank you. Jennifer?
I was being Robert there for a minute.
You, what, rambling?
Yeah.
I know you've got a couple more slides. Would you like to go through those slides prior to me opening up to any public questions or comments?
Yeah.
Okay, then why don't we go ahead and do that? Thank you. Well, don't go far, because I suspect one or more of the public questions or comments might be for you. So you wanted to go ahead and go through the remaining slides?
Sure, yeah, I've just got 3 more slides.
Okay.
And one of them is kind of a fun one.
Okay.
So I wanted to just kind of root us in as we're talking about, what does the future look like for Placer County, what we are doing now. And I think you summed it up actually fairly well, where we've, a couple years ago, based on your board's direction, stood up a housing unit. And that means that Shauna Purvines and her staff and Cedra, myself, our economic development director, our HHS director, and staff from our facilities department get together once a month, and talk about how do we implement the housing work plan, because we each have a different role that we play in that. But it's not our full-time job. None of us work on housing really full-time. Shauna also does economic development, and we all do a variety of other things. So it is kind of catch as catch can. It's not 100% focus of any of our times. Shauna and I have done an initial review of the 58 counties in the state of California based on the work plan task that suggested that we look at both internal and external structures. And we see a lot of different things. We see housing authorities that are used as a basic model, and some of those are internal to the county that are housed in a department, some in the county executive offices. I believe ours was the only one that I noticed, at least in my review, in Health and Human Services. Others are in the land development departments. There are a lot of different ways it happens. Monterey County, and I think it is, let me just check my notes so I'm speaking correctly, San Bernardino County have their housing authorities separate, a little bit more similar to what George is referring to in the town of Vail. One thing I will say that I see is that jurisdictions figure out what works for those jurisdictions, and the models really follow the paths or the kinds of housing that you see are needed in those jurisdictions. There, in some cases, a lot of focus on innovating around farm worker housing or housing for military. I saw that a lot in Monterey County and Napa County specifically. I saw more innovation in jurisdictions that were growing or were already grown. You see a lot of innovation in San Diego County and the city of San Diego in partnership together. And you see innovation in Napa County, where you've got their county executive office and economic development and their T-bid, and interestingly, and a housing trust fund, all working out of one office. And there are a lot of different things that relate to their agriculture and tourism business that they have pulled under one department. Riverside County is very similar in that nature, where they've got an economic development agency that manages housing, economic development, special events management, et cetera. You see in Sonoma County, they have a community development commission that oversees their work. In fact, that's something that I would note in a lot of these jurisdictions. They have at least advisory bodies suggesting to either the Planning Commission and or the Board of Supervisors what to do on housing. So that may be a little bit similar to what George has done, although I don't know that I saw any that had full agency other than potentially Monterey and San Bernardino on what they're doing. So there are a lot of different approaches out there in partnering with other jurisdictions, whether the county takes the lead like they do in Sacramento County, and they have a joint powers authority under the Sacramento Housing and Redevelopment Agency, or they work with partners. There are a lot of different ways to get this done. And I think that was Shauna's and my intention to look at what's happening in California so that we can be sure that we're looking at models that legally can also work within any authorities or constraints that the state of California may have. Because certainly what Vail has done is something that meets their needs in Colorado, so very similar to what we've got here in eastern Placer County, but there may be other approaches we look at and partnerships we look at on the western side of the county. I will say in some legislation that Shauna and I have commented on and some rumblings that we're hearing about this future potential redevelopment Part 2 or 2.0, whatever you want to call it, there's a lot of conversation about cross-jurisdictional partnerships so that the counties don't get hurt by things that the cities may want to do in standing up a new redevelopment agency. And we have made comments on that legislation that if something like that were going to come forward, we would like to see the opportunity to work outside of our county jurisdictions. Obviously in eastern Placer County, the lines between the town of Truckee and North Lake Tahoe are there for our jurisdictions, but really our employees and our workforce, our businesses rely on that back and forth on a regular basis. So that's something we'd want to see on the organizational side. And then I'll just move to the funding piece because George, of course, focused on that. Shauna did mention earlier, we just signed the contract with Bay Area Economics. Hope to have some good data from them and looking at what is the countywide housing need. What are our rules in place that will dictate how many houses will be provided by developers, and then really what's that gap and how might we go about funding that? Certainly, we've seen in other jurisdictions, the county of Santa Cruz has actually had a parcel tax in place since 1978, and they do things like pay for people's rental down payments or deposits so that somebody can find an easier way into housing, and then they pay that back when they move out. Other jurisdictions, Napa very specifically, I believe Monterey also, looking at a T-bid or a transient occupancy tax to fund housing. Some charge TOT a higher level on short-term rentals because of the potential to impact the availability of long-term rentals. sales tax, general fund, former tax increment that came from the redevelopment agency. Other jurisdictions are doing that. Bonding against existing resources that the county has, looking to state and federal grants. There are a lot of jurisdictions, again, doing what fits for those jurisdictions, then funding a lot of different programs that those jurisdictions need. So really, I'd like to kind of wrap it up by saying you've learned a lot today. I want to really thank your board for taking the time on this. The panel, I think they may want to engage in some more answering of questions or conversation. I think that a lot of folks from the community turned out, faces I haven't seen before, and usually I know everybody in the audience at a Tahoe meeting, so it feels great to have some new folks interested. I think it indicates that it is something a lot of people are have on the back of their minds. The question is really, I think, for your board, and let me move on to the next slide here, and it was alluded to more than once. Where does Placer County boldly want to go? So I'm hoping that your board will provide direction to staff. Don't worry, I'll turn that off in a minute. I'm trying to hypnotize you. This is my favorite part of the presentation. Yes, exactly.
Seizure-inducing.
Beam me up, Scotty. We do look forward to the conversation with the community, with the panel and your board on what sorts of things that here, I'll turn off now. What sorts of things did you hear today that inspired you, that seem interesting, that might be applicable to Placer County as a whole or to Eastern Placer County? So we do look forward to that conversation and learning about where we go next. Thanks so much for your time.
Thank you. And thank you for the Captain Kirk reference. And thank you for that courtesy laugh, Mia. Thank you. You didn't. Yeah, that's right. It's because you're not traveling at the speed of light, like those of us on the Enterprise. All right. This is the time that I promised that we were going to allow for questions, comments, general observations that you can either share with our board, questions you can ask of the panel, comments for George about how lucky he is to be out here in Tahoe and not stuck in grimy old Vail, right? Anybody want to address the board on this? Yes, ma'am. Please step right up. Please identify yourself for us. And we're going to ask you try to limit your comments to 3 minutes, but if you go over, that's okay too.
I forgot to bring a pen, and I meant to make a few questions, and I'm going to try to stay organized. My name is Peggy Meadows, and my husband and I retired up to Auburn back in 2010. I lived most of my life in San Mateo County, and I was quite involved in workshops such as this, and I was on an affordable housing committee and things like that in Pacifica. I grew up in Pacifica. So that's just a little background. I was a realtor, and so I'm always interested in home values and that kind of thing, but I'm also very interested in transportation organization, as I've talked to Jennifer about before. And so one big concern is the more houses, hopefully not the more traffic, because traffic is a big deal here. You guys know more about things like sewage and water supply and that kind of stuff, so I'll leave that all up to you as to how you think that the area can handle that. I had a question for Mia, one thing. If you do have denser housing and you reduce the requirement for the parking, what happens on the adjacent streets? And as far as, are these usually streets where they can't just overflow onto the streets? Can they be like within a couple of blocks of transportation, public transportation? And can we try to keep improving our public transportation so that, the whole thing meshes together better?
So clarifying, I think the original requirement was like 3.5 parking spaces per unit for an apartment.
It was down to 1.5 or something.
Now we're about 1.5. The reality is most people don't own that many cars in families, right? So, there's the anomaly. You have a whole bunch of kids, you might have 7 cars, but, quite honestly, if you... I love saying this, that often more parking does not relieve your traffic. It just means you're putting more cars on the road. So frankly, if you give everyone a whole bunch of free parking, guess what? They will park a lot of cars, and they will use their cars more frequently. So the reality is, as we've heard, millennials and seniors are actually two ends of the spectrum that the huge population boosts are in our millennials and in our seniors, and frankly, neither population drives as much as the current generation, like your Gen X, I'm an X, Y, you name it, people with a lot of cars and are living out in the burbs. TRPA says that there are 7 car trips a day on average, back when I did my project, which is ridiculous because when we surveyed our residents, we had about 30 to 40% that did not use their cars on a regular basis because they either took transit, they walked, they skateboarded, or they rode their bikes on a regular basis. So the reality is it's choice. So if we give everyone lots of free parking, they will have lots of cars.
Yeah, I understand.
If you place the housing strategically near your transit, you will actually have more people with options that will take transit. In the case of Kings Beach, we also gave free transit passes to everybody for about $60,000 worth of our fees went into free transit. And we gave passes to everyone. So there was a huge spike in that. And one of my conversations, too, because at the time it's 1 hour headways along Highway 28, which frankly, it's hard to set your life up on 1 hour headways. I know going to the doctor was like a half-day event. So, and one of my frustrations in talking with the transit agencies was that we really needed 30-minute headways. We needed faster, more predictable times. But the reality is you don't have the population that's going to ride the bus. So catch-22. You need to have more people who demand the service to create better service. Right. You can't have better service without any riders. Right. So part of it is we have to create the kinds of density and demand that's going to require transit and squaw. And frankly, not everyone can upkeep a car. It's something like $10,000 to $12,000 a year to upkeep a car, especially one that can survive up in Tahoe. And for someone who's earning less than $40,000 a year, $10,000 is a lot of money. So the reality is if you can give people choice, shuttles, creativity. I know the AHSC project that Placer County won also required 30-minute headways. If we can start seeing that on a regular basis, not just in the summer, that will absolutely help predictability and create the kind of mobility choices that we need.
Yeah, keep it cheap, too. Yeah, that doesn't cut into my 3 minutes, I hope. Anyway, regarding the smaller houses, this is not the best climate, I think, for tiny houses. I love the idea of tiny houses. Monterey area, that's a great idea. But up here, I think with the harsh weather in the wintertime, a little tiny house is going to be harder to take as far as being able to keep warm in the winter and that kind of a thing. I think it'll use too much energy. I'm just thinking that's better to cluster it as much as possible.
They actually use less.
They actually use less? Okay. Well, if you already know that, that's great. It just didn't seem like it to me. But in the San Mateo County area, one thing I was hoping that I didn't hear it brought up is more of the home sharing idea. I mean, I was on this committee where we did reduce the requirements for second units, making it so that you don't have to have as much off-street parking, that kind of thing. So trying to make use of the existing mega houses, which there are a lot of up here. I hate to see so much waste. Oh, already? Come on. Anyway, so those are things that are very important to me, and home sharing is a big deal. San Mateo County's had it for many years. It does take more staff. You do need to have somebody who's coordinating it, helping people who are getting older, don't want to move out of their house, but have these extra bedrooms that maybe they could have somebody come in that could also do some in-kind type of services or something so that the rent can be really reasonable. But you need a coordinator within the county to help match people up properly. And there was one other thing, something to do with that. As far as helping keep it so that you're making use of the houses year-round. And, oh, darn, maybe I'll see somebody at the reception afterwards and I can talk some more.
Sounds good. Thank you so much.
I'll be very brief. Jeff Lux, Town of Truckee, Town Manager. First of all, I just want to thank the panel and George. Great information, great presentations, and I want to thank the board and the staff. It's just thanks for coming up the hill and thanks for doing stuff on housing. It's huge, and we've got to work together. And through Mountain Housing Council, we're working on it. I just have a question, and maybe any panelist is welcome to give it a try, or even George if he'd come back. But we talked a lot about producing new units and new units and new units, and no disagreement there, but we know how expensive that is, especially in the mountain environment with construction costs and difficulty of finding tradespeople and all of that. And the snow loads really adds to all of those kinds of things. My question is, what's the role of rehab? We have a lot of deteriorating units, both in the basin and up our way in Truckee. What's the role? We talked a little bit about the sort of trying to take advantage of all those bedrooms that aren't being used. That's a difficult conversation and a hard one to figure out. a little bit about that. And then what's the role of trying to maintain existing affordable and available housing stock? And in particular, I'm thinking of things like mobile homes and things like that, which we see disappearing pretty quickly and at a fairly accelerated level in some cases. So, how does that, what role does that play, would be a question. Thanks.
Members of the panel want to speak to that?
Sure, I'll throw out a couple of ideas. So, of course, mobile homes were governed by HCD, so they're state governance, not local governance, and I think Placer County knows that all too well, right, in terms of like building issues. I think that one of the innovative things we did in Kings Beach were taking motels and tearing down the motels, redeveloping them, but taking the existing density off those motels. That was incredibly valuable from a TRPA perspective. And we actually did a very interesting survey to justify the density of 30 units to the acre. And we did this study where we actually looked at other motels that had single family, or rather people living in them, and there were up to 90 units to the acre in terms of like small units that fit a whole bunch of people. But being able to take that density and be able to kind of be creative about how you situate it, whether it be whatever type of home, whether it be modulars, whether it be manufacturing, to get that density and borrow off of that and get existing coverage, all of that is very, very desirable. So I think they're great resources, but the prices of those are very high. So I think getting that conversion, so again, that's maybe more of a partnership structure, but I think there's a lot of value from a reuse perspective and from a taking commodities off of those types of units perspective. As far as rehab, though, it's really challenging when you're dealing with the kind of state money and federal money to rehab old motels, rehab old houses, because they don't fit any requirements anymore. Whether it be energy, whether it be ADA, and they were built so long ago that it's really it's unworkable. So unfortunately, you have, in my opinion, given the conditions too, because they're just quite harsh up here, you really have to start from scratch. You scrape and you go. But there are existing commodities that are very useful in this region that I think are very strategic to be thinking about as you look at land sites.
Kirk, I can kind of take a little whack at Jeff's question as well. So, Jeff, one of the things, and you know this because you're part of the Mountain Housing Council group, is we looked at not just new construction, but rehabbing in the right instances existing, but also really trying to protect the existing structures we have and do a better job of managing and maintaining those so that they don't get to a point where you really can't rehab them or they're no longer livable. I think, frankly, I used to work in the building industry. It's way easier to build new things than rehab things, as Mia has said. And so I think our focus has largely been on looking at new construction and what opportunities there are there. But there are people that are doing innovative things right now. The thing in the Tahoe City Marina, of rehabbing those existing, they were commercial office space, and they're now going to be 8 affordable and 2 market rate. Is that right, Jennifer? Am I getting that right? So there's some of that that's going on. It's way harder than building new.
If you don't mind me adding something to that conversation very briefly, Placer County's Empower program is an opportunity to rehab existing structures to meet standards for livability, whether it's for to improve the environmental costs of a project or to reduce the cost of paying for utilities, et cetera, with double pane windows. So I think that is an opportunity for people who own properties that probably are past their prime.
Any other panelists want to chime in on any of that? No? Okay. Go.
Hello, my name is Nikki Caravelli. I am a Tahoe local, and I want to follow up on that last discussion by saying that I have a lot of people that I know who've struggled with housing, and unlocking is something I think would be really helpful. If you take, for instance, someone who owns a home but they don't rent it out because it's really old, it needs weatherization, it has all kinds of problems, but they don't have the capital to remodel that. I think providing capital to people to remodel those homes and weatherize, you can unlock those homes and also address the energy efficiency side. Also improve existing housing stock and retain young people. When my boyfriend and I first moved into our house in Truckee, there was daylight in between the floorboards of our bedroom and below the window that we actually had to seal ourselves. That's luckily we could do that, but that's a public health thing and that's an energy cost thing. And it also doesn't make us want to stay, makes us want to leave and go to Reno and find better housing that's more affordable. Also would help people not feel like they have to turn to short-term rentals to afford that capital cost of remodeling those old homes. If they have a capital loan or whatever, then maybe they can just transition that house right into long-term housing rather than feeling like they have to do Airbnb for the higher turnover cost. And finally, millennials, my age, love density. We love being able to walk to town. When I tell people I live on East River Street, everyone's like, oh my God, like I'm so jealous. So.
I just have to say, I had once gotten a mysterious email that someone told me that I was Manhattanizing Kings Beach with the housing that we built. Manhattan, so there you go.
Manhattan, by the way, which is the greenest development in the United States because of density in terms of energy, water use, transportation, emissions. I'm not suggesting we should become Manhattan, but we should not be writing off density done
Samir,
appropriately.
is there something you want to add to this conversation at this point?
I have a separate comment.
Those are welcome, especially right about now.
Samir Tumo, North Lake Tahoe Resort Association. I'm just so pleased about this whole discussion and George coming back yet again and the panel and staff and you guys putting the time into it. I think it's terrific. There are a whole lot of ideas. This is a very, very complex set of issues. I just want to talk about money. Because without the money, none of this is gonna work. And I think time is of the essence. I think we really need, we want to get going. We want to get housing. We want to make it available. We want to make funds available. And we have an idea that we think can provide very significant long-term funding for the county to use for housing. This is an idea that's not new to most of you, but I wanted to bring it up in this context. And that is, as the Resort Association, we have been very strong proponents of a T-bid in order to produce some funding for local marketing and initiatives that the business community wants to undertake. How does that relate to housing? That relates to housing in that we believe that through that process, we then could turn back a significant number of dollars, maybe $3 million, maybe more than that, to the county, that the county could decide to use for a variety of things. I think transportation and housing are the two that I hear the most concern that people would like to see that money go to. $3 million a year, let's call it just for round numbers. Vail's not doing a bad job with $2.5 million a year, but I was just talking to George. He would like, and I think the idea here would be that you can take that $2.5 to $3 million a year and bond against it. Right. And leverage it, right. And make and if you have that money coming, and the reason Vail hasn't done it yet is because they don't have a regular, reliable stream of income against which to bond. But if we had that regular, reliable stream of income every year in the number, in some number, and it may go up over time, that gives you real bonding power and real significant dollars that could be used. And then how you implement that and whether you do a similar program to what they've done with the deed restrictions or incentives or other things, there's a whole bunch of ideas floating around. But I just wanted to focus in on, here's a way that we believe by the end of this calendar year, you could be in the position of being able to bond very, very significant dollars to contribute to incentivize this type of development at the right location. So something that's here, that's now, we need your support on the T-bid in order to make that happen. But I think it's a real big part of the solution that could happen real quickly.
Thank you.
Thanks again, Shauna Doherty, Mountain Housing Council. I just want to make two comments. Absolutely, it's money. For the last year and a half, we've been out talking to the community in our work teams, out in other communities, and we have so many incredible ideas, and all of them are going to require money. If we want to do deed restriction, if we want to do more down payment assistance, all of these incredible things that if we want to unlock houses and provide some kind of incentive, we always end the meeting with, yes, let's do it. We just need some funding. So that's my first thing is supporting all the comments about that being absolutely key. Number two, I wanted to comment on Supervisor Montgomery's comment about looking at your next year's budget. And I've been in conversations with Town of Truckee, Placer County. I'm constantly working with staff and also with George and trying to kind of merge all of our job responsibilities and trying to think about sort of this RFP that we're doing to look at the next entity after Mountain Housing Council and who's going to do what, and George's comment of like, well, whose responsibility is it? And really those successful communities that we're seeing have all of it. They have all of those tools in the toolbox. So we do need, we would love to see allocation of budget for a housing point. I can just tell you that some of the work that I do is going to be sunsetting. I'm meeting constantly with people that want to come here and do projects. That is not the role necessarily of county or town staff, that I am getting those calls of people that are coming with know-how and dollars and they want to do projects in our area, and I'm doing tours with them. I'm talking to them about our areas. And so that is part of the job description that this person could do. And honestly, we cannot keep up. Your staff can't keep up. I can't keep up. That is a great place to be. We have incredible opportunity, but we can barely keep up. So having some more resources and some more staff would be incredible. So thank you very much.
Thank you. All right, we're right at about 4:30 now. Any last public comment? Please step on up. Anybody else after this gentleman interested in addressing the board? All right, after he's done, we'll bring it back to our board members for some thoughts. Please go ahead.
Yeah, great. Thank you for your time. My name is Scott Ehlert. I'm a budding developer in Truckee and Tahoe. First question is for Mia, and I'm really kind of curious about the density levels that you hit at 30 units per acre. That's currently more than anything that we're seeing in Truckee being zoned for and around the lake. And I'm just kind of curious how you kind of managed those like landmines and kind of got people on board and kind of hit that density number.
Well, it wasn't easy because there were lots of landmines and the rug was pulled out from under us so many times. However, it really came down to going back to what I was talking about earlier with Jeff's comment on the motels and kind of banking some of the density that was there. So because TRPA let us do that, that kind of helped set the baseline. And then also we worked very collaboratively with Placer County and we got a density bonus for the whole Tahoe City and Kings Beach area. So there is state law called SB 1818 that, by the way, everyone has to follow this law. That allows for 35% density bonus on top of existing base density for a variety of affordable tiers. And so that gets you greater density. So of course, because of the affordable side of it, we got greater densities because of state law and then because of what Placer County put in place. So that really helped us move the needle. But quite honestly, and I've heard since then, certain things got fixed in terms of like greater densities in general. So I think that's also very important. Under the new state law, SB 35, you can take existing general plan density and add to that and actually use SB 1818 to get density bonus. And you can go above 35%, by the way. In Stockton, I think I got 80 or even 100% density bonus if you go above because of one of the concessions. So SB 1818 allows for a certain percentage of affordability, but you also have concessions that you can actually get greater increases in height, setback, as well as greater increases in density. People don't know that, but it doesn't stop at 35%. You can go higher. And then other things stop it in terms of height. You know, we ended up maxing out at 3 stories, period. So between coverage and all the balancing of parking, coverage, and everything, everything else, we really sort of landed at the right sort of prototype. And the other goal that I had for Kings Beach is I only wanted to design sort of a series of buildings that I could repeat on every single site. So we came up with a prototype that worked, that gave us a 3-bedroom and a 1-bedroom module, which was really our most demand, and allowed for everything to fit under the TRPA rubric in terms of height, roof shedding, you name it, everything had to be done. So we created this prototype that could be built, and it happened to be at the 30 units per acre density.
Okay, great, thank you. And then,
But I will also just
yeah.
mention, however, that when Mia left here, she swore she was never coming back to the Tahoe Basin. So we're glad to have her back. Thank you for coming in for round 2 of pain.
And then a quick second question I'd open up to the panel as well as the board. Our neighbors, they purchased their house last year up in Tahoe Donner. They paid $1.4 million for a house that they've spent maybe 14 days at over this last year. You expand that out over a 30-year mortgage, and they're paying about $6,100 ballpark per night that they're staying in their home. It seems like that demographic could absorb maybe a small property tax, a vacant home property tax, to help with the impact fees of developers that are trying to address the housing issues here. Do you feel like there would be support in both the business community as well as the civic community for something of this type? Thank you.
I think that was directed to you guys.
I think I would support that, a vacancy tax, yes.
I can't answer that on behalf of Squaw Valley Alpine Meadows, but I also live in Tahoe Donner next to a house. Sounds just about the same. So as a community member, I see exactly what you're seeing, and it makes me scratch my head a little bit. Yeah.
And I'm just going to say, I think Prop 13 might have something to say about that. So, all right. With that being the last of the public comment, I will bring it back to my colleagues to see if folks have any thoughts on what we've heard today or want to provide any additional direction to staff. I'm seeing no activity down that end. I'm going to switch my attention down this end.
Right, I'm just going to
All right.
berate you all publicly.
Well, before you do that, before you launch, just because I acknowledge the wings, now that I'm in the center here, it's my turn. I am very intrigued by the Vail model, and I think it may have application here. I think that getting at the issue of rebuilding a middle class, if you will, in the Tahoe Basin, as Cindy has often commented, the missing middle that we have here in the basin, as people have found it far more advantageous to simply sell their homes and move out of the basin, provides a multitude of benefits. Not only do we address the affordable housing issue, but when you reintroduce families as full-time residents in the basin, you do start to build that sense of community, but you also build an indigenous workforce, because the people who have the $1.4 million vacation rental that they come up and stay in, their kids aren't going to be running lifts at Squaw Valley, but the people who live up here, they might tell their kid, you want your ski pass, go get a part-time job working at Squaw or Alpine and you'll get your ski pass. When I coached at Squaw a number of years ago, a number of the folks that I knew over there actually grew up here in the basin or in Truckee, and they had some of the best parties, actually, because they knew the area. But I think that focusing a little bit on how we might be able to, on a pilot project, implement the Truckee model, or excuse me, the Vail model, in partnership with existing efforts, in partnership with existing initiatives. I don't want to see the county, quite frankly, go hire a bunch of staff for this. I'd rather the county figure out how, to Samir's point, through allocating some revenue that might otherwise be going somewhere else for infrastructure, we include housing in our definition of infrastructure, and perhaps redirect some of our TOT on a pilot basis to see, can we actually move the needle on this affordable housing issue here in the basin through this model, but with appropriate partnerships so that we're not adding costs into the equation at the staff level. I'm very interested in seeing what we might be able to do along those lines. Supervisor Holmes, you down there. Yes, yes. Yes.
Am I on? Oh, here we go. So the issue comes down to finding available property that has services, water and sewer, needs density, and then also transportation. So that's a hard challenge to find.
Yes, that's in the model where we want to build it, as opposed to like the Vail model, where an individual looking to acquire a property or an individual who owns a property is willing to sell the deed restriction, works with the jurisdiction to say, I'm willing to restrict it for affordability if you're willing to buy that from me, kind of like we do with our ag conservation easements.
Right. No, I agree with that. So the lady talked about shared housing, and I have to go back into the last century. When I went to college, with my wife and I had shared housing with an older gentleman that needed some care. And so we were able to make it through that. And then when you're getting to density for the millennials, you know, I'm no millennial, that's for sure. But as I age and I keep thinking about where I would want to live, that's where I want to live. I want to live in a downtown center where I can walk to the theater and, more importantly, to the brew pub without getting in trouble and getting in my car. So I think that's the trend for my generation. I see that happening a lot as well, moving into smaller units in a more dense area. That concludes my comments.
Thank you. Thank you. Supervisor Gore.
So I really appreciate this conversation, and I am echoing. I'll sit back. All right. A couple of things. I agree that we need to start moving forward. We don't want to wait. I appreciate the work that our team has already done, the Mountain Council, working to start thinking about ideas. And I agree that we really need to not wait and move forward. I appreciate the idea of a pilot project so that we can look at what can we start moving the needle on now and not waiting. I'm not convinced that we have to add a whole bunch of staff. We might look at what our resources are and think about a dedicated staff member. And I still have a lot to do on my understanding where we're at with the budget. So I've got a little bit more homework to do on my end. But I think that we don't want to wait. I would like to see maybe a pilot project with some deed restrictions, seeing how that works. Like you said, we've done it with conservation easements. This is something that's critical to address infrastructure and housing. And I appreciate thinking about housing as part of infrastructure because we won't be able to be successful in our communities if we actually don't have the housing. So I really would like to start moving forward and not waiting and seeing how we can make some progress in this area.
And Kirk, if I
Yeah,
may,
sorry,
just
Jennifer,
to Supervisor Holmes' point about identifying sites that have the infrastructure and have all that. We've actually already done that. We have 104 what we call housing opportunity sites that meet those specific aspirations, I'm just going to say. And so we've done that part of it. So now the question is like, how do we actually activate those sites, engage with the partners, as Shauna has been doing, take them on tours, show them the sites, help streamline the process so that people can get through, get around all four bases, not cut from first to third, I think as George said, but, do it quickly. And my concern, I understand the concerns absolutely around budgetary constraints and not wanting to bring more staff on. My concern is it sounds like Vail didn't really get a handle on this until they identified a specific set of folks who are going to really only focus on this. And there's only two of them. You're not a huge department. I don't think we would need a huge department, but my experience is when you ask people to do 1,000 different tasks, it is very hard for them to prioritize those things that we agree are priorities, because the barking dog becomes the problem when it's really housing. And so I would just like us to at least consider in our next year's budget process, looking at what would that look like if we brought on one, maybe two people for the county, maybe one who was more focused on the east side, one who was more focused on the west side, because they are distinct problems or distinct variances on the same problem. So I would just encourage us to at least not dismiss that idea out of hand and consider it, at least in our budget process, as we would consider anything else moving forward.
And if I may, Supervisor Wygant, just clarify my point on this, Jennifer, is especially if we're going to look at doing a pilot project, just to see how that model might work here locally. All I'm thinking is, does it not make more sense to partner with the Community Foundation or some other existing nonprofit where we're willing to pay some small or some portion of the overhead for a staff person? I agree it will take somebody who's dedicated to this, but I don't believe that, at least for pilot project purposes, it needs to be a county employee. Is there somebody already up here in the community already engaged that the county can help subsidize a position within an existing nonprofit, and in order to run the administrative side of identifying properties that are suitable or responding to the market as the market identifies the properties that are suitable when people come to us? So that's all I'm thinking, is at least for this interim period while we are talking about a pilot, is there not a partnership with an existing nonprofit that might make a little more sense from a staffing standpoint?
And that's absolutely worth looking into.
Your microphone, please. Thank you.
That's absolutely worth looking into. I know that the Community Foundation hopes at some point to take this off their plate as well. So.
Yeah, I think first reaction is to thank everyone for a great afternoon, particularly staff for bringing it all together, but also our nonprofit partners. That all of the years that I've been kicking around with all of this, I think there's clearly more focus and energy than I've ever seen. The problem, of course, has been emerging and worsening. But in the face of what I think is some great success, way back in my years on the Planning Commission, we did Tahoe City Community Plan and the Kings Beach Community Plan updates. We've had some tremendous success, and that's part of what's causing this issue to be driven more seriously. But I think what we need here at the board level is some very specific. I'm really intrigued with the Vail model, so I want to thank you also, George, for coming out. But I think you want to bring to us now some specific options. Clearly, I think the county has, for example, a strong culture overall of working with nonprofits and our community partners. So if there's consensus that we need more staff resource, for example, and/or budget issues, bring back to us some specific things, and philosophically we'll winnow down and get back to you direction, whether that should be in the shape of nothing or more county staff or partnering with more of our nonprofits. But I think really now, in working with the business community, we want to get to the point where we're looking at more within that window of options that you have brought forward to us, for which essentially we've given you a green light, some more specific strategy steps and components and ideas to really take some of this energy and bring it forward more.
All right. I guess I should turn on my microphone. Thank you, Supervisor Wygant. With that, just quickly, staff, Todd, you guys have what you need, I think, at this point by way of direction from the board. I think you've heard definitely a consensus that there's interest in seeing what we can do to find funding to pursue at least a pilot program on exploring perhaps the Vail model here. Anything else that you need from us at this point?
I think we have general direction. I think what we're going to do is go back and look what funding opportunities do we have, how do we allocate dollars in a manner that have a longer term impact, and then obviously working with Steve and Jennifer and the folks up here, we'll talk about how we align the staffing.
Okay, so thank you very much. All right, well, thank you all for participating in this conversation. Enjoyed it, and your participation made it worthwhile. I especially want to thank our panelists for being willing to give your afternoon to this. And George, thank you very much for coming back out. It was very helpful. It says we adjourn, but I think it's a brief recess at this point, more than an adjournment. But we will be getting back together over at the, where are we? Tahoe City Golf Course, Clubhouse Cafe Xenon, is that how you pronounce that? As a Trekkie, I guess you should know that. All right, so that's at 5:30. Thank you all very much.